Go ahead. GDPR. Accept cookies.
Accept cookies.
Or you won't have access to
always accept cookies. That's what I tell my son.
Always
If a stranger can write it up. Are we starting, please?
Just wait maybe 1 minute. I'll go. You have some water?
I just had some. You're doing most of it.
We have 8 participants. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all, both virtually and in the premises of the ETUI here in Brussels, to this workshop on the future of remote work after COVID-19. And let's be clear about it. The title could have been The Future of Remote Work During COVID-19, just as much as it could have been, as it is about the future of remote work after COVID-19. We're still in the midst of this very interesting pandemic. The signs are that the pandemic is becoming increasingly endemic. I think the extent to which teleworking and remote working is still a practice in member states and the nature of teleworking and remote working very much depends from the national arrangements that are being taken in place. We are connecting from different countries. We have guests that are joining us, guest speakers that are joining us from the UK, from Switzerland, from the other side of the Atlantic. Arrangements vary considerably, but what is clear is that teleworking, remote working, and teleworking within various forms of remote working is not just a flavor of the month. It's here to stay, and here at the ETUI for the past year or so, we have been trying to elaborate on both the impact on teleworking, on a number of important aspects of our work, life, society at large, on, of course, the present, but also progressively on the future of remote working practices, which teleworking is clearly emerging an important phenomenon. We have tried to put our thoughts together in the context of a working group dedicated to the impact of COVID on the world of work. It was set up almost exactly a year ago, and this is one of the many products and ongoing projects, ongoing concerns of that working group. Our workshop today is genuinely that. It's a workshop. It's a forum for experts who have been working on this topic for some time, some of you well before the pandemic, I should say, to share ideas, share thoughts, bring knowledge and understanding forward. It's an ongoing conversation that we're having. It will, of course, eventually start producing various types of outputs. We can have a conversation about this as well at some point in the course of today or in the near future, but it's very much part of a process that will continue for some time, projections are suggesting. A key preoccupation that we had in a working group and with some of the colleagues that intervened, also external colleagues that intervened in the working group, was the effect that the growth of remote working practices during and progressively also as we phased out of the pandemic could have on questions such as equality, with new divides emerging, equality also with previous divides, pre-existing divides being reinforced, contractual security, contractual rights. There was and there is a clear indication that teleworking and remote working practices can be associated with a reduction security and the cogency of the terms and conditions of employment, a progressive shift to new forms of contracting out and hollowing out of the enterprise, the substitution of certain workers and certain tasks with technological devices, whether bots. And we have all experienced some of that, often as users of services that during the pandemic have been increasingly provided by external service providers, bots. If you've had the misfortune of having to engage with Zoom for the purposes of retrieving one of your recordings, as we sometimes do, you know what kind of very interesting conversation you can have with Zoom bots these days. So this is still very much developing, and in this first section, we're having the opportunity to share ideas on the current developments, but also the future prospects of remote work with some genuine experts, both within this room and within this virtual room. The first speaker is Uma Rani, senior economist at the ILO. She's joining us remotely from Geneva. I was discussing with Uma that one of her very early publications on platform work and the Covid-19 pandemic with Richard Kumar-Deer was one of the papers that I read, one of the papers that we shared, and that to a large extent inspired this event. And I can safely say the same for a second speaker today, Abby Adams. She's joining us for Oxford, where she's an associate professor and a senior researcher at the University of Oxford, highly respected progressive economist, and one of the earliest publications focusing on this pandemic and the impact that it had on inequalities is her highly cited Inequality in the Impact of the Coronavirus Shock, a great paper, and just the first of a series of publications on the subject. She eventually founded the COVID Inequality Project, and they're doing some great work. She will share some of her knowledge and her findings with us in the course of this first session. And then the other speakers are Kalina Rabayeva, who's a researcher here at the EQI, and Paula Franklin, a senior researcher here at the EQI. They have also spent a considerable amount of time researching and writing on the inequality dimensions of the pandemic, and also in particular on the inequality dimensions and impacts and potential impact of remote work. I think it's important as we start this day to note from the outset that there is no belief here at the ETUI that remote work is necessarily, existentially destined to produce greater inequalities or to diminish them. And we're very much open about this question. We're also very aware that the answer to this question cannot be left to the markets, to the market forces. It's something that needs to attract a concerted level of attention by policymakers, the social partners, and of course by all those who are working on the topic, to make sure that there are no unintended consequences that would adversely affect the lives of workers, the life of certain groups in particular, and societies at large. I think nobody here believes that the invisible hand is going to sort out telework for us. And there is a genuine sense that telework and remote working practices could be extremely liberating, but also that some of the prospects that they open need to attract some serious investigation and serious attention by researchers and policymakers, and of course the social partners. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Uma. Uma, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and thanks for inviting me over and for your kind remarks. I have to say I'm a bit envious of all the people who have made it there in person, because I'm at the moment missing such in-person meetings. But I think for the present, I'll do it from here and hope in near future we can all meet. So when Nicola did invite me, and I think when I got the final invitation, I was wondering what exactly to talk about. And we had a quick exchange, and I thought probably what would be good for this meeting would be to focus on remote work and digital labor platforms. Actually, last year, soon after the pandemic, ILO had released one of the policy briefs on the definition of remote work, and actually it's quite broad in a way. It talks about teleworker on one end and looks into also home-based workers, home workers, teleworkers from home, remote workers, and all of it. So I thought that, not necessarily agreeing with all of that definition that exists, but I think to an extent it does cover most of it. I thought for this presentation, I'll just focus on the digital labor platforms or the platform workers and try to understand, based on the new data that's coming in, what are the trends we see? And also I bring in some of the findings that we do have from our platform report and other new surveys that have been actually conducted. So the ILO has been working on some of these issues for a while. And in 2017, the ILO, one of our colleagues, John Messenger, along with Eurofound, actually brought out this report on working anytime, anywhere, the effects on the world of work, which actually looks into a lot of this telework, ICT workers, and all of it quite in depth. And this year, we have had two reports coming out, one by my colleague, Janine Berg, who's also here and will be speaking later this afternoon on working from home, where she looks at home-based workers from the manufacturing sector to the services sector. And later on, the next month in February, we had the digital labor platform report, which is largely focused on the platform workers, which is a new type of remote workers. And that's where the whole worrying picture is. Now, the remote work is not new, as we all know. It's always existed. It's a pre-industrial phenomena. It's not just a 19th century phenomena, but also exists in 21st century in many of the developing countries as home-based work or homework from textile and garment sector to the automobiles. And a lot of it is done through subcontracting. I think there was a lot of concerted efforts from informal worker organizations and associations to actually protect many of these workers. And they did work quite closely with ITUC and other organizations and were very successful in 1996 to have the Homework Convention passed. But unfortunately, the convention did not get too many ratifications. It still stays at 10, if I'm not wrong. And it hasn't gained much prominence because employers did not really agree to many of the things there. But that doesn't mean that it's not of use or value. I think it's still very relevant today. And it's gained a lot more relevance with the entire remote work happening within the services sector. But I think it might be important for us to relook at some of the aspects within the convention and try to see how we can push it. Now, within the services sector, what's very interesting to see is that the spread of information technology and the deregulation of the telecommunication sector, I think this was the changing point in the mid-80s onwards that actually led to the BPO outsourcing companies to thrive and the call centers to come in. And the reason why I've put that up is largely because, well, that's not necessarily remote work in a way, because it's still done in firms. But what's very interesting point is that the minute such a kind of a remote work could be done, they came up with other new ideas. And very much in mid-90s, you saw telework actually appear in software, finance, banking, and media. And some of this, the software, finance, and banking, were earlier within the business process outsourcing company sectors. So it's quite interesting to see that a lot of this research was actually picked up in India in mid-90s and early 2000s, much before other countries actually jumped onto it. And you find a lot of the issues that we talk today being discussed right then. The whole insecurity debate, the whole classification debate, the whole precarity debate. It's very fascinating to see all of this and the gender implications of it, because a lot of this work then was done by women inside homes. So you saw that there was this entire home-based work happening at the higher end as well as at the lower end at that point of time. At the ILO, we've had two reports coming out, one on offshoring in 2010 and then in 2017 on working from anytime, anywhere, which actually captures much of this debate again. The new outsourcing model that we do have with the rise of the digital labor platforms is a new type of remote work. And this is what I'm going to concentrate on. And that's risen largely from 2000 onwards. So what I've done for this presentation is to show you based on the OLI, and I'd like to thank one of our colleagues from Oxford Internet Institute, Fabian Stephanie, who's actually helped me get the data and with the graphs, where we have tried to, because we are now working with Oxford Internet Institute on this database, and it's now called as an online labor observatory. So this data that you see is the demand for work, which is your red line, and the blue line is supply, and it's based on about 5 major platforms, both freelance and microtask, which has, where they have been tracking this data since 2016, and it has about 70% of the market traffic, and it covers about more than 115 countries today. So what you clearly see, and the data that I've plotted here is from 20 January on to October 2021. So you very clearly see that there is a rise in demand, and this demand has been increasing continuously over the period of time, while the supply has been, it looks from the graph that it is going down. I'd like to make a point here that when we are measuring the supply of labor on these platforms, it is basically the registered users. And if the number of registered users are coming down over a period of time, it doesn't mean that there are not so many people that are there on the platforms. But what you clearly see is that the demand is going up, which is probably a more appropriate indicator to actually capture. This is not very surprising, given that many companies, both in the global north and the global south, have been laying off workers and have been moving towards platforms to actually try to get a lot of tasks done. And this is what this particular graph clearly illustrates. Now, if you start looking at which occupations have increased, clearly one of the occupations for which the demand had increased and where you also see a very high supply is the software development and technology. This is no surprise in a way, because the demand for tech goods actually increased enormously during the period, not only for what we are today doing, Zoom and Skype and Teams and all of it, but also there was a huge demand for goods actually and purchases onto the online platforms, which meant more IT investment, more needs for tools, IT tools, and as a result, you saw a huge demand there. And many of the laid off workers or many others who thought that they could actually jump in and try to make money actually as labor did go onto these platforms. The third thing that we do see is that, especially in the developing country context, there was also a rise in telemedicine platforms because they were trying to reach many of the backward or rural areas in many of the countries, which again required different types of tools. And the fourth area that we see is the rise of education platforms and education apps, which again saw a huge demand in it. The second area where we do see an increase is the creative industry. And again, here you do see a rise even in the supply, while the clerical and other activities actually gained importance only in 2021. Till then, it was quite dominant. Now, three countries that actually occupy top positions here are the UK, US, and India. This is no surprise at all, because much of the demand in many of these platforms actually comes from US, which is almost about 45%. It has been going down and up. It's been indexed to actually show what the trend looks like. And you very clearly see that the demand went up during last year, and then it came down, and then you again see a rise now over the last quarter, especially from the US. While that in India as well as the UK, it's much more, has been quite stable, and India has been US has been seeing a bit more decline over the period, while the supply has been declining in India. And there we see that we are not able to understand what actually dominates the decline in supply, because in India, the share of workers declined from about 34% to 15%. And that's something we would need to understand, whether it is registered users not increasing, or is there something else that is happening. While you see that the number of workers in US and UK has actually increased. Apologies, I think the demand, I read it wrong. Actually, it's India which has been increasing over the period and not US. And what it also shows with the increase in demand for services from India is that it's no longer the global demand from US and UK, but there's also regional demand that is coming up, and that is largely dominated by India. And what is driving all of this is very clearly the tech sector, because the tech sector is the one that is actually leading to this rise and not all the other sectors. So you see the trends very similar to that of occupations, all occupations, largely because of tech driving the entire sector, and the demand in the tech sector has grown in all of these countries, while the supply in UK has been increasing, while that in India has been declining. Now, there have been a number of other studies that have been done over the past year, which have actually tried to understand what is happening in this particular sector. Basically, are the platforms increasingly being utilized or not? So there was a very interesting study done by Harvard Business School and Boston Consulting Group, where they talked about the blended workforce. And they had a survey of about 700 companies in 2020, where many of these companies were actually using freelance and programming and innovation platforms. 30% of them used extensively, and 30% of the others used it quite moderately. And 40% of them actually reported increase in productivity and innovations. One of the things that this study actually goes about arguing is that this is not anymore a kind of an experimentation process where we are trying out whether freelancers, workers would work for us or not, but this has become a kind of a strategy that they are actually adopting, where they have a small core workforce, but along with it, they are trying to have as much of freelance workers and programmers as they go by. I'll shortly explain what kind of programming platforms are and how they actually utilize it. Much more recently, there's been a study by IBM Institute and Oxford Economics, which went about doing a survey of about 3,450 executives in 22 industries in 20 countries. And they went about seeing that there's a real push towards enterprise agility. So what you see very clearly is an acceleration of digitalization, and whatever resistance that was there earlier is now actually being overcome because COVID-19 pandemic is being used by companies to push forward and use many of these techniques. And they're very clear and open about it in their report. And they almost say that 66% of the company executives actually go about saying, yes, there was resistance, but now we can go ahead and do it. And about 65% of the respondents also say that investment in IoT, cloud, mobility is going to be a priority, and that's the push they are going to have. And what was a bit shocking to see was that a whopping 94% plan to participate in platform-based business models. Sorry. Now, other thing that we are observing is that companies are also increasingly adopting hybrid models. Now, what do we mean by hybrid models? So, you do have a traditional company that exists, and now what they're doing is they're buying platforms so that they have the core workforce within their organization, but at the same time, they have these freelance workers whom they can actually depend on to get the work done. And one of the set of companies that is really challenged as a result of the rise of platform business model is actually the IT/BPO outsourcing companies, largely because you have a lot of innovation platforms that have come. So, across industries, there is a lot of digitalization that is happening. So these companies don't need to anymore go back to IT/BPO outsourcing companies to get their work done. They can actually solve a lot of their problems through these programming or innovation platforms that are there. So as a result, one of the strategies that has been adopted by some of the IT/BPO outsourcing companies is to come up with a hybrid model where you have the platform integrated within the company. And that's exactly what Wipro actually went about doing in 2016. So what it does, what these platforms do is like, on Topcoder, one of the tasks that a company had got was to find, solutions for lung cancer. So what they did was they floated this as a problem on the Topcoder platform, and it was floated for about 10 weeks, and the prize money was about $55,000. And they invited contestants, about 1,000 of them. 500 participated from 62 countries. And you had 34 contestants submitting 45 AI solutions. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate with this particular example is to show that if Wipro, as a company, were to come up with 45 AI solutions for this particular problem, it would take it years to complete it. So what they are doing is basically, with the Topcoder platform, they're able to provide multiple solutions at a very, very low cost and in a very efficient manner, because you say, well, this particular contest or competition is only open for such a period of time. So within that, you actually get that. So this is very good for the company. It improves productivity, efficiency, whatever indicator you want to use it, but it has huge implications for the workers. Now, what's been happening is I did have an opportunity to actually talk to some of the workers in this company as part of the work I had done for the report. And it was quite interesting to see that there's a lot of insecurity, even though you might be a core workforce in a company, you are getting more insecure, largely because you don't know when you are going to be replaced by that platform worker, because you do not have those skills. So while the company goes about arguing, saying that, well, the platform also helps to train our workers, to allow our workers to compete in these platforms, to gain skills and all of it. But I think it's just a process of time when many of these workers might not be, the contracts might not be renewed, or they might be replaced easily, or the contracts might be terminated. And during the COVID-19 pandemic last year, we saw that many of the IT outsourcing companies in India especially, they had laid off thousands of workers actually, and they had all moved a lot of their work onto the platform. So what you see on the rise of the demand for projects on these platforms is as a result of this trend that you see. You also find that new tech companies that have come, like Google's, have bought over Kaggle, which is another innovation platform in 2018, which largely concentrates on data analytics. So Google, over a period of time, does not need to even employ anyone. And all it needs to do is ensure that the data analytic platform works, and freelancers or the competitive programmers actually participate and go about doing their work. The other area which doesn't really necessarily get a lot of attention, and I thought it's important to flag, which I guess many of us in this room do know about it, is the whole AI-enabled services, which works in a human-in-the-loop way. Now, they do provide a range of services, from secretarial down to image annotation down to financial, legal, and patent services. And much of it is advertised as AI tools. But often there is a human in the loop, which nobody mentions or nobody talks about. I think one of the problems with digital platform workers, at least you know that they are platforms, and you do know that workers do get registered. I think one of the limitations of what AI-enabled services do is you do not know that there are workers in human in the loop behind actually doing this work, because they're never reported by anybody. So this is something that needs to be discussed, talked about, captured, and I think it's a larger question how this will be done. Let me just conclude by saying that what is happening, what I very clearly see from these trends, is that there's more precaritizing of workers. There's a need for regulation very clearly, but I think what's much more important is universal labor standards for all workers. And the reason why I do feel that this is much more important is because the classification issue is very important from a European from the North American context. But I think much of the developing countries, there's quite a bit of blurring of the line between what is the way you are employed as an employee also, because often you're on a temporary contractual situation and not necessarily a permanent contract. And many of these workers are classified as self-employed. And I think the more trend that we see of this outsourcing happening, and given that there's lack of employment opportunities in many of these countries, workers often do not have much of a choice but to get on to these kinds of works. And I think for them, it would be very important to address and to see that they have all protection that they require. And I think through this effort, the erstwhile home-based workers in the manufacturing sector who have till date not managed to get any of the protections. I think we do have this convention, we do have many of the regulations, but in reality, many of the workers do not really have any protection. They don't even have minimum pay or minimum income security for the kind of work they do. So I think that should be sort of the move that we should go on. So while digital labor platforms, we do know all of these lacunas that exist, what is also increasingly happening is with the increase in demand on platforms, it is also leading to a lot of competition among workers. And many of them, at least even in our survey, we found that workers were providing free services or underbidding, largely to ensure that they can build up their reputation and they can have a rating. And this was for tasks. This is not discussing about micro tasks, which takes probably a few minutes. One is talking about freelance work where you're spending sometimes a week to perform the work, and then you do not get paid because you think that by doing the free services, you have a chance and a probability to get future work, which is very sad to see, but you do see all of these practices being followed. Finally, there is also a huge toll on the mental health of all workers, and it takes different forms depending upon where you are. If you're a platform or a temporary worker, there's instability and insecurity that arises from the nature of work. While for many of the permanent workers, it's a huge fear they have today of being laid off. And the IBM study actually goes about showing also that about 22% were either temporarily furloughed or permanently laid off since the pandemic began. So there's a huge insecurity that it has generated as a result of digitalization. And I think the last thing I'd like to leave with is that there was recently a piece that came out about how thousands of Swedes have been embracing and inserting microchips under their skin, because this seems to be a new form of control. And many workers probably will fear that if they do not have this, they might not be able to access the labor market itself, or might not be able to have any sort of a permanent employment. While this is argued, I think the whole microchip argument is coming from a thing saying, well, it's digitalization and more efficiency, but it has very clear perverse effects as a result of it. I think the last point is, I think the technology should be used much more to protect the workers rather than precaritizing them. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uma. That was extremely insightful. It reinforces some of the hypotheses that we have been working on, but also adds some very novel, worrying perspectives. Abby, the floor is yours. If I could ask the speakers to try and more or less stick to the 15 minutes suggestion, so that we can have a chance to take a coffee break.
Absolutely. Thank you, so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. Can I just double check that people can see my slides? Yeah, excellent. Okay, we're jumping straight into it. So we all know that working from home has, of course, been a huge part of, the labour market of, I'm going to be focusing more on developed economies and also thinking more about kind of, I would say, what's going to happen within traditional employment relationships or traditional firms here. So not just have within existing employment relationships. So are we seeing kind of more people working from home because of the pandemic, but also new jobs that are being created are more and more as well, kind of including these working from home provisions. And I guess what I just wanted to do with you over the next 10 to 15 minutes is at quite a high level go through some of the key forces that we might want to keep an eye on in terms of thinking both about how persistent is this working from home or hybrid working going to be, but what are the impacts on like the wider economy and how we think about good job creation and how we think about inequality in this context. So the kind of main messages, depending on how much I have to kind of rush towards the end, because it's always the case that I have too much to say in these like 10 to 15 minute slots, is of the, kind of focusing again, if we're thinking here about, European economies, or let's say the US, of course, it's the case that not all jobs can be done remotely. And there is a huge amount of place-based work that exists in the modern economy, which is it's very difficult to see how all aspects of that will be outsourced. But that more and more of especially high-income individuals' work can be done from home. That we have actually seen a shift, if you like, in the frontier of what is possible, of course, over the last 18 months. Now, in terms of thinking through what does this mean, how persistent will it be in a post-COVID or endemic COVID kind of world, there are a couple of things that I wanted to kind of lay out. So the first is, how is it that we think about the productivity of home versus office-based work? And there are a couple of aspects to this. So on the one hand, if you thought about kind of before the pandemic, most economists were mainly talking about commute, like kind of saving on a like kind of costly commuting time when you thought about productivity savings of working from home. But then if we think about actually the way that innovation happens, the way that kind of creativity happens is often very different in fully office-based work to fully online work, and again with hybrid work. And so understanding a little bit more about how that's going to be affected going forward, I think is going to tell us a little bit more about which types of jobs going forward are going to be more likely to be working from home. The other thing, and this fits into a lot of the trends that Uma was talking about, is working like a job which is done, so an average job that is a working from home job or a hybrid job versus an average job which is your kind of traditional office-based jobs. It's not just the location of the work which typically changes there. There are other aspects of job design, be it actually, you know, the nature of the employment relationship, so self-employment and etc. that Uma was talking about, but also just the narrowness and the specificity of what is actually required in that job. So you typically see narrower jobs which are being advertised in terms of working from home or have a high hybrid component, such that they can kind of fit in to other things that the firm is doing. So you see this kind of, if you like, fragmentation or narrowing of particular aspects of jobs that goes along with hybridization to enable, even in kind of more traditional firms, some version of what Uma was kind of calling like a human in the loop type process. And another thing that we need to think about in terms of the persistence of work, and also what we think about in terms of how changing relationships between employers and employees, is how we think about monitoring quality and monitoring work when work is done remotely between employers and employees. And so something that you might think is going to affect how easy it is or how willing employers are to kind of hybridize parts of their workforce is the ease of monitoring. And this leads to kind of new innovations in surveillance and tracking and kind of very, very close monitoring of all aspects of work. And you would expect that, given that, you know, people aren't necessarily co-located, and that's going to bring along as well, I think, a range of rights-based issues, of stress issues, and also potentially like the creation of more opportunities even for thinking about further fragmentation of work down the line, as if you like, we're creating data on more aspects of actually how work is done. Then equilibrium effects. So what some of the macroeconomic models, which are now starting to include working from home in, show is that even if a small portion of the workforce, you know, actually starts working, say 2 or 3 days a week from home, like, which is quite a big shift when you actually think about realized hours from pre-pandemic, that can still have really big effects on how we think about the spatial patterns of demand, about who and how, like which workers are in which jobs, and also the kind of nature of like the demand for some of these, if you like, place-based jobs, like office cleanings, or kind of, you know, restaurants and cafes. And so I guess the point I want to make here is, you know, even we shouldn't just be focusing what happens into the jobs which are being done online, but you also need to think about how does this affect the workers doing jobs which are not being done online. Now, in terms of the inequality aspects, as Nicola said, there are a number of different dimensions to this, not all of which, and it's kind of, this is something which I think is going to be empirical, because there are risks and benefits on many sides of this. So economically, as I've said, many of the jobs that lower income workers do are very, at the moment, very difficult for all aspects of those to be done online. So working from home is regressive. But on the other hand, economic inequality is often quite spatially concentrated. And so if you can open up labour markets kind of beyond exactly where you're living, that might bring more opportunities for individuals. On gender, we have both that working from home is going to make it perhaps easier for working mothers and working caregivers to balance caregiving responsibilities with paid work. But but at the same time, if working from home kind of comes with it like fewer career opportunities, as I've said, working from home jobs are typically narrower. You might expect there for reasons for there to be lower wage and employment progression within those jobs, given that they might not necessarily, we need to be thinking about how to tightly control them and fit them into other aspects of the process. Finally, as well on disability, these innovations may be very beneficial, and some work that I've done in the past has shown that there is large demand for people who are unable to work in offices or find it very costly to, so this is going to again open up opportunities, but at the same time this still needs to be kind of decent work. Okay, so I'm going to try and focus on a couple of these. As I've said, working from home is regressive. So this is data that we've collected on the ability to work from home during the course of the pandemic in the US and the UK by income levels, and you can see a very strong income gradient. Already what we've seen is large numbers of employers investing in making it easier for their current workforces to work from home. So what this shows you here is changes in the ability to work from home, even over the course of last summer for different types of occupations. And what you can see is that for those occupations which went into the pandemic, again, with it be, people intuitively thinking they could do some of their job from home, even if they weren't, this is where we've seen the most growth. So we've seen polarization of the ability to work from home across occupations. I kind of mentioned this, but there's a lot of, I would say, more kind of theoretical as opposed to empirical evidence on the way that you think about kind of innovation and the way that you think about, creativity. It works very differently. If people are, well, actually, it works differently for all offline, all online, and hybrid. And I think there are real reasons to actually think that hybrid could actually be, in some senses, the most challenging in terms of excluding individuals who might not be in the room and having their kind of ideas heard. And as well, I'm really sorry not to be there in person, because typically it's over those coffee breaks that you get new ideas, as opposed to just connecting with existing ones, which is one of the ways that working from home kind of typically works. Now, in terms of the knock-on effects on the structure of the economy, there's a huge amount of spending which goes around having workers in offices, be it in Pret, be it in cleaning, be it in commuting. And so if we're moving typically higher income workers outside of that space, there are going to be these equilibrium effects on demand elsewhere. And we've already seen this in the UK, partly, because we've managed our pandemic so badly, and also partly because we've turbocharged some of the spatial aspects of this inequality by dropping property taxes, causing already quite large changes in property prices and where individuals are moving within the economy, such that we've seen this rise in kind of suburban house prices as individuals are moving out of the city. Workers are already potentially being laid off on commutes. And indeed, there's this kind of changing spatial pattern of demand, which I think will be really interesting to think through what the impacts of this are. In my last 2 minutes, so why stop at the country borders? This again really complements what Uma was saying. There are two things here. If we're making it easier for some individuals to work from home, well, why not outsource more? Kind of completely. why are we even thinking about workers here? Actually, if we're creating more training data sets on exactly what the aspects of work are because of all this monitoring that's going on, why not just start automating more parts of the employment relationship? So I think there are some kind of, I think we really need to think, we're thinking long-term here and really future. We're creating massive data, creating massive digitalization on the data resources on the process of work, which will likely have implications later on. As I briefly said, working from home isn't the same for everyone. I've done work with Janine, who will be talking to you later on this. I've also got other work which really shows that, that whilst there are benefits from having it easier to balance work and care for working caregivers, that there are consequences of that in terms of interruptions and in terms of boundary setting. Another thing that we've seen, I think, across the pandemic is this interaction between working from home and housing quality. And so, it's much more difficult for you to work from home if you're in poor housing, multi-generational households, low space. And so again, thinking about who is it that is able to do this, I think is quite important. But I'm gonna, as I've already said, I'm gonna end there because I'm definitely out of time. But as you can see, I think this, and happy to kind of follow up more on this in the Q&A. When we're thinking about the future of hybrid work, I think it's important to go back and think through why is it, what are the kind of structural issues which are going to be causing certain employers to want to keep working in the office versus out. And also really thinking through how this is going to interact spatially, I think is really important. And just because I knew I only had 10 minutes, I just wanted to also say I'll be talking more about this actually at an event on Tuesday. So I wanted to be a bit kind of cheeky and say, if you want any more, then you should. I'm giving a talk as a part of a public series on Tuesday. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Abby. Not cheeky at all very, very interesting. In fact, if you send us the link, we'll try and share it on the chat. Thank you. My ETUI colleagues, Kalina and Paula, are presenting now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone in the room and online. And thank you very much to both of you for these really interesting presentations. I'm just trying to put up my slides. There we go. So Paula and I will be speaking today about the topic of telework and gender, on which Abby, in fact, just touched upon. And what we really, what we really want to do is really to elaborate on and really stress the gender dimension of telework-related issues, both in terms of opportunities and challenges, and then to reflect on some future directions for legal and policy measures in this respect, and solutions to some of these challenges. And so what is the link between telework and gender? Well, to a large extent, it has to do with the distribution of unpaid care work. And again, Abby already alluded to this. And the fact is that telework offers possibilities for better work-life balance, particularly important for those with caring responsibilities, so workers under a double burden of paid and unpaid work. And this is, we already mentioned, saving on commuting times, but also the ability to organize work around care tasks. But at the same time, it is associated with increased availability, longer working hours, the intensification of work, and the blurring of boundaries between work and private life, which then exacerbate work-life conflicts, and which is something, again, particularly acute for those with caring responsibilities. And so, in fact, telework can be a double-edged sword in this respect. And we know that it is, in fact, women who continue to perform an often much larger share of unpaid care work and therefore have a higher double workload. And here, this is sort of just a visual representing the differences in time that employed men and women spend per day on unpaid care work across the EU. So this is from 2015, where on average across the EU, the then EU 28, women spent 1.5 times the amount that men spend on unpaid care work per day, where we consider these differences are much bigger in some member states. So in some member states, that's as much as double the amount of work spent on care work. And so this double burden of paid and unpaid work affects women in various ways, as is well known. Work-life balance conflicts can affect mental and physical well-being, And many women also do not participate in the labor market to accommodate care responsibilities at all, contributing to gender gaps in employment, which is into the 2018, which was largest at almost 12 percentage points. Many women also take up part-time, temporary or casual work and or career breaks, contributing to gender pay gap, gender gaps in overall earnings and pensions, which remain significant to this day. And so we know that this double burden affects women's lives and careers very significantly. And so telework, in particular home-based telework, and in particular combined with flexible working hours, could contribute to, in a sense, easing this double workload or enabling women to accommodate care responsibilities alongside paid work, and therefore contribute to increasing labor market participation, but also encourage the equal sharing of care responsibilities, because it also, of course, allows their partners to stay at home as well. And here it is interesting to note that already before the pandemic, 57% of home-based teleworkers were women, whereas they constituted under half of teleworkers generally. And the share of women in teleworkable occupation is estimated to be much higher, in fact, than the share of men. And you can see the figures is 45 to around 30%. And during the pandemic, it was also recorded that somewhat more women than men started working from home during the pandemic. And so all of this suggests that as telework becomes increasingly available and as new forms of remote work keep arising, women are likely to take advantage of opportunities to work from home, and maybe somewhat more likely than men, and particularly to engage in home-based telework. But this comes with some significant risks. And one of those is that there is a risk of that this will entrench gender stereotypes regarding care, as well as the existing unequal distribution of unpaid care work. So women choose to work from home, and therefore the stereotype of women work from home, women take care of the household is perpetuated. And it can even lead to an increased double workload. As women stay at home, they can take on more care work. And there can also be effects on productivity due to disruptions, which again, Abby mentioned as well. And there's other risks, and these are not now related to unpaid care work. There's an increased risk of online harassment, including sexual harassment, but also domestic violence, as women spend more time in the home. And gender gaps in digital skills could also be relevant and be a close disadvantage, seeing as these skills are required for telework, which could particularly affect certain groups of workers, particularly older women and those with lower educational attainment. And there are, of course, then on top of this comes the risks affecting all teleworkers, regardless of gender. But I will let Paula say a little bit more about this in her reflections.
Thank you very much, Kalina. So it is evident that there are several different aspects to consider when discussing home-based telework from gender perspective. And one of the rather fundamental ones that merits further reflections is the concept of gendered space. Now, the division of social space into the private sphere of home and the public space, as we see today, for example, in Europe, is can be said to be the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, and it corresponds to the ideological concepts of feminine and masculine. Now, feminist theories on the relation between space and gender view the separation between the public sphere that is attributed to masculinity, production, and professionalism, and the private sphere attributed to femininity and family as a key element in reproducing gender inequality. Now, this division has had many ramifications for structural gender inequalities, one of them being the division of labor, in which home is for unpaid work, while the public space is for work with remuneration. Now, while the blurring of these boundaries between the public and the private spaces had already commenced way before the pandemic, and home-based teleworkers were struggling with the issues we have heard about today from the previous speakers already before the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis has brought the challenges to the forefront in the world of work. And I have four brief reflections as the meeting today is about reflections and sharing ideas. First, what we can see is that often work conducted in the private sphere of home remains subordinate to the work conducted in the public sphere, for example, in the office, in terms of respecting the work and the output. And if this remains the case, the home-based teleworkers will remain disadvantaged in terms of reduced professional visibility and career prospects, as Abby was mentioning, and access to information, including on workers' rights and personal and professional support. Now, for women, working from home has often been the only feasible way to combine childcare and paid employment, which has constructed the situation as one in which the employers allow women to work from home, and as a result, they may have poorer terms and conditions, less autonomy, and poorer working conditions. Now, second, one consequence of the gender division of space regards trust, as was also mentioned, the previous speaker, Abi. Now, the legacy of presenteeism extends to home through employee surveillance. And research shows that teleworkers often experience greater pressure and expectations related to accessibility and availability from their employer, but also from their colleagues. Yet again, we can reflect on the premise that home is constructed as the opposite of remunerated work. So to put it bluntly, public space, for example, the office, is where the real work happens, while home-based work, including unpaid work, remains invisible or devalued or even suspicious. If work continues to be conceptualized as occurring mainly in centralized location outside the home, it reinforces the gender division of space, which in turn has impact on home-based workers, regardless of their biological sex. So the societal ideas based on the binary division between the public and private space also make it difficult to argue for legislation of things that appear to be in the private realm. And in the context of home-based telework, the issue of development and enforcement of health and safety provisions, for example, is a key area of concern. And therefore, my third reflection concerns psychosocial risks that home-based workers are exposed to. Now, here we are talking about long working hours, lack of work-life balance, isolation and lack of social support, job insecurity, as we heard as well previously, and online harassment and violence. Now, there are many psychosocial risk factors, and we know that they have a direct and also a cumulative impact on the health of workers. As Uma mentioned, the relevance of mental health in this context. Now, evidence shows that during the pandemic, women had higher levels of exhaustion and stress, particularly due to work-family conflicts. And in general, negative consequences of work-life conflict appear to be stronger in women. For example, showing as poorer self-reported health among working women than men. Now, if the future of remote work does not address the psychosocial risks, we are looking at increased morbidity due to mental health and musculoskeletal problems. Now, while the risks can have a negative impact on all workers' health, as women are more likely to do home-based work, as Kalina shared the data, and also lack work-life balance, the gendered health impact will be clear. We are already in a situation where women in the EU spent 19 years of their life in poor health compared to 15 years for men. In some member states, women spend 25 years or more in poor health. Now, it is therefore a great concern that there still are only isolated examples of gender being mainstreamed into occupational safety and health legislation and policy, as well as workplace action. The right to disconnect that is being discussed a lot today in today's politics is an example of one specific measure that relates to prevention of psychosocial risks. However, it is fundamentally important to understand that we need a host of measures, as the right to disconnect does not, for example, resolve the issue of work intensification. The sources and the factors of psychosocial risks in telework are beyond the control of the individual worker. You can think of, for example, high workloads or remote surveillance that is imposed on a worker. So therefore, the preventative measures must also be taken at the collective, not at the individual level. And finally, perhaps a word of hope. Now, even with the challenges that home-based remote and telework brings, people want to telework, as Kalina pointed out in the data as well. The sustainable and decent remote work does not happen by taking the office-based model, let alone the abrupt, compulsory pandemic time telework model, and just transferring it into home as such. But the transformation requires major efforts. Now, flexibility in terms of working space and time should not be one-sided, so that it only concerns the adaptation on behalf of the worker, but the organization of work requires that the workers participate in the planning. In this way, you will find the gender differences and facilitate the inclusion of the gender perspective into telework policies and practice. Now, the future of remote working should in no case be gender blind, but to strive to be gender transformative. And in this regard, it will be interesting to see if and how the hybrid space of home and teleworking will be reconceptualized in terms of the social practices, institutional forces, and in the material aspects as well. Thank you very much, and back to Kalina.
Yes, I just want to wrap up, just to highlight a number of sort of solutions, just some of the solutions, and I think Paul has already touched on some of them that we need to think about already now and over the next years on this topic. I think one really important thing is gender mainstreaming in the regulation of telework. So really to not just to recognize the gender dimension of the issue, but also to develop gender sensitive solutions that are incorporated in regulatory frameworks, including of course collective agreements. Another much talked about measure is the right to disconnect. Paul has already mentioned that. There was an initiative by the European Parliament, so we'll see what comes of that at the European level, but it has been introduced in some EU member states, including over the last years. One thing to stress is also the importance of working time autonomy, so also including flexible working hours. I already mentioned that in this context, it's been shown that home-based working combined with flexible working hours is what increases the benefits of telework for those with care responsibilities, but in general, also working time autonomy is important to reinforce the positive aspects of telework from a work perspective. We need to think about obligations to prevent risks to physical and mental health, so psychosocial risks as well, as Paula mentioned, and hold up employers to framework agreements. And we'll see how these develop as well over the next years. And just to finish on a note, I think many of the issues that we've talked about today, they stem from gender inequalities that have sort of existed for indeed a very long time, and they would like to exacerbate them. So I think it's important to remember also that we need to make efforts to address these underlying inequalities. And in this case, one that we talked about a lot was the unequal division of unpaid care work. And so promoting the equal distribution of care work between men and women should remain, and I think should be something that we increase efforts on. And I think the pandemic has shown this very clearly that we really need to do this. And this could be through improved family-friendly policies, investment in care services, or even the rethinking the regulation of working time in general. And so frameworks like the Work-Life Balance Directive and the Working Time Directive perhaps merit a reevaluation in this respect. So I'll finish here.
Kalina, Paula, thank you very much. Also, thanks a lot to Uma and to Abby. This a massive thanks also to all the participants that have tuned in. We have received a large number of extremely interesting questions, most of which have already been answered by our very kind speakers. So I think we're gonna bring this first session to a close and have our 10-minute coffee break and resume promptly. Thank you all very much. It's been extremely interesting, extremely enriching. In touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And
Bye-bye. Bye.
great papers. Yeah, Kalina and Uma and fun. Thanks.
Thank you.
No, we're not.
Everyone knows.
I was not leaving. Connect with your computer. Yeah.
There are some people coming here who don't know whether it's
Hello, everyone. We are now back, and we will start with the second panel. I'm Zana Rasnic, and I'm a senior researcher at DTI, and it is my pleasure to share today the second panel on this quite fascinating and extremely relevant topic. Because in my life, I would argue that telework is one of the best developments of the COVID pandemic, but that's when you have kids and don't want to commute. So, okay, so to start off today, we have three extremely brilliant panelists. We have first Ode Cephalio, who is a fellow researcher at the ETI in the Occupational Health and Safety Unit. She not only does health and safety, she also expands a bit much broader in the labor law, especially collective labor law, and what I also find fascinating, strategic litigation. Then the second one, we have Silvia Rainona. She's a fellow researcher very close to my heart because she's working at my unit. And she works in EU labor law, also EU social and economic policy and governance in a broader sense, and digitalization. So all sort of areas which also are relevant when we speak about telework. And finally, but certainly definitely not least, we have Professor Uglješa Grusic, who is an associate professor at UCL, and I promised myself that I won't do any Brexit jokes, so I won't. And he's an expert in European, not only European, but private international law and interplay between private international law and human rights and employment law. So extremely interesting and relevant in the telework perspective, where and we are physically now in Belgium, in a country where we have many workers teleworking from home in the Netherlands or Luxembourg because it's just so geographically close. So it is extremely relevant to speak about private international law in the context of telework. So in general, I would say that our panel, the first panel dealt very head-on with telework and various aspects of it. We are more, I would say, contextualizing telework in a broader setting. And so yeah, Ode will start with contextualizing telework in the setting of occupational health and safety, and making sure that and probably setting up some scenarios how we can still obey health and safety rules when we are teleworking, which is extremely difficult issue to tackle. Then Sylvia will explore the concept of autonomy in the context of telework and sort of a myth of autonomy, which exists, I guess, when we are working from home. And finally, Uglješa will deal with private international law and telework, so namely Brussels I and Rome regulations, which I think I haven't heard enough about, certainly in the context of telework, and extremely important for any practicing lawyer as well, and certainly trade unionists too. So without further ado, we will start. I will give the floor in the order we are in the program, and we will do it like that each of you guys do your presentation, and the time limit is 15 minutes. I have even prepared a note to show when the time is up, so that we managed to open the floor a little bit for the questions, and then I managed to take some questions from the Q&A stream. Okay, without further ado, Ode, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dane, for this nice introduction. And also, I have the chance that I will simply also rely on the previous presentation that has been done up to now, who already emphasized that health, physical and mental health, is crucial in terms of telework, COVID-related or not. And here I'm going to be diving a bit more into the topic about the law and how, in, well, my vision, OSH principle, legal principle, is a fundamental requisite to have successful telework and remote work now and in the future. And as a matter of introduction, but once again, it has been said before, COVID really created a moment where we are considering telework not only for, well, the time being as reducing exposure to the virus, but also later on when it won't be necessary as a public health measures for also a structural way to organize work. And the question is, when it won't be a matter of protecting ourselves from this virus, how can we still guarantee that this way of working is safe for the workers? And what I would like to briefly emphasize, that it has been said already before, the question of telework and also health is not new. And as you can see in the literature, it has been already like covered in the pre-pandemic studies. And I took one example with Montreuil and Lippel in 2003, who have noticed some elements that just arise in terms of health and safety in telework. Interestingly enough, now, of course, with pandemic, we have seen a lot of a new wave, bad joke, a regain of interest for telework and health and safety, especially looking at how it has been impacting health during COVID time. And I took the example of Romisco et al. In 2021. And which is really interesting is in both cases, they emphasize the same kind of risks, even if they are almost 20 years apart. In both cases, they notice that one of the main risks is the design of the workstation on the workspace and basically linking it with the problems of the musculoskeletal disorders. Similarly, they already, once again, 20 years apart, noted the problem of long working hours or overworked, and as Paula and Karina said before, the blurring lines between what belongs to the private sphere and what belongs to work. And the final, or one of the main problem is raising through 20 years ago, it was isolation. Now we talk about psychosocial risks, and isolation is one of them. Once again, it has been noticed in both times, just maybe carried amplified for many reasons. What I want to say as a bit of a side note before I keep talking about these three main problems and how we can address them, in both cases, 20 years ago and now, some workers also said there might be potentially a positive effect of telework. And once again, we talk about telework in a really specific consideration, but there is also studies showing that actually telework, if it's a couple of days per week, can be really good for productivity and mental health. So even if we focus on the negative, let's not lose this positive aspect and keeping it in the back of our mind. So, the question was, or what I think is interesting, first of all, is the impact of COVID on telework, because telework has been seen as the main answer, once again, to prevent a threat at work, which was the threat of the virus. And here we adopted telework as a measure of prevention, the collective measure of prevention. And there is a really good table provided by Buziri et al. In 2020, beginning of the pandemic, this is important for later, listing some risks that has been, and then connecting it with COVID. So the first risk was the one associated with transportation and commuting and basically getting, COVID, let's say, in commuting. Then there was also the risks of related with the home and working environment, psychosocial risk, and behavioral risk. I won't enter into the details here, so there is a reference at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to focus on two things. First of all, the risk of the work environment where there is a problem with the work design, so musculoskeletal pain. And here, interestingly, the author recognized that there have been an ambiguous effect of COVID. And actually, because it was done in such abrupt way, and it hasn't been being able to prepare it properly and being planned like it should have been, then there was an increasing risk of having musculoskeletal pain at work for the worker who has been teleworking. They say here that it's the short duration of exposure. Here, the fact that it was published in 2020 places that in perspective, and the more we go on, of course, the more people have been teleworking, and this risks increasing over time if there is no appropriate workspace and work equipment. Then there is the risk of social isolation in the professional sphere. And here I think it's Abby who said, for example, creativity, sometimes it can isolate you and all of this. Here, COVID, according to the author, he said that it has been a reduced risk because everybody was teleworking. I would say that because it has been so long, there is still a risk of a weight and a burden on the mental health of being isolated from each other, even if we are all equally isolated. Then there is the increase due to boundaries, blurred boundaries, and that has been amplified, as Kalina and Paula said before, because of the societal measures as well, the school closing, the having the burden of carrying home and homework, literally, and of course, COVID amplified, and normally in normal telework, this is less the case. The table will provide some example of how the employer should and could prevent. One of them is actually, of course, information about how you can set up your desk, how you can, well, take breaks, monitor your work, and also like, I don't think, but I think there's a question of providing, of course, the workers with the adequate work equipment. In the second line that I wanted to emphasize, it was like having virtual collective space. Here, there is limits to what we have with like Zoom meetings and all of this, but it is an option. And then, of course, adapting the working time to ensure that people with care duties can manage both, keep ensuring that people don't end up with the burnout. So that was how COVID amplified. And once again, I think we need to make a distinction. Telework, once again, was a measure, a collective measure to address a real risk of the pandemic. And it was actually as an answer to the framework directive and the general principle of prevention. When there is a risk at work, the employer has to assess it and then have to take collective and individual measures to either, well, eliminate the risk or reduce it. And he has to do it with a dialogue with the workers' representative, consultation, and information. And once again, telework has been adopted to be sure that workers are not exposed. And that was really, it is the best way to ensure like social distancing. What we missed here is that we didn't prevent the risk that might arise from telework. And normally that should have been done as well. And in a context where there is an increasing number of companies who are planning to have structural telework, partial telework, occasional telework, and in a structure, or even now, this week, we will have more and more telework, we need to have the discussion of how do we make it safe for all the workers who are going to telework in the coming weeks, 100% or 4 days per week, right? And here we have to rely on the framework directive, but not only, there have been a European framework agreement on telework, which has been adopted already in 2002. And in this agreement, we have a couple of principles that have been agreed, once again, among the social partners in the EU and should have been implemented at the national level by now. One of them is actually providing adequate equipment to the workers and being sure that workers are not under a financial burden when, well, that shouldn't rely on the workers to be sure that they're safe at home, technically, according to this framework agreement. Also, there is an entire paragraph on health and safety and the fact that the employer is and remain responsible of the health and the safety of the workers, even though they are away from the premises of work. Even if they are at home, the employer is and should remain responsible entirely for the health and the safety of the workers. And here the general principle apply and all the daughter directive. And which is interesting is that already in the framework agreements, all the risks, physical and mental, should be assessed by the employer, should be at the workplace and at home. So there is really a lot of work to do here and a conversation that can already happen with legal basis. So what is interesting is, well, once again, maybe I will be quick here, is to say that there is already in what we have in the corpus of the legal framework, tools we can use to address ergonomic risk and psychosocial risk factors. Once again, the fact that the employer have to assess this risk and should consult the workers' rep. So even now, for people who are going to restart companies to have telework, you have to have, or employers should have a discussion with the workers' rep. How are they going to do this in a safe way to address ergonomic risk and psychosocial risk for the weeks or months to come? And there is a way to do it. You need to change the work organization to do it in a safe manner. And here I really invite you to look at the really good policy brief published by a colleague of us at the TUI, Pierre Berastegui, who will come into a bit depth of what are the factors for a successful and safe telework agreement. And once again, the reminder that that shouldn't be on the workers to pay. So once again, we need to have a discussion how we do that. We need to have a discussion how much the employer is going to pay, what he's going to pay, and how he's going to do that. Not only for having a screen, for having a desk, but also for being sure that people benefit from enough light and are not being cold. This is daughter directive, so there is an obligation technically to contribute to heating and electricity and so on and so forth. Also, we need to really address the risk of PSR to be sure that the next working conditions are not going to lead to work-related stress, excessive workload, or even tension among the team, because I think we have all seen that when you discuss only online, this is really different from face-to-face and tension might arise. And if there have been already channels done for the workplace premises, we need to adopt that in the digital format. Let's take the quick example of Belgium. There is a person of trust normally that you're able to see all the time at work, or most of the time if you have an issue. We need to find ways to be sure that workers can still talk to this person, even if they are isolated at home. So once again, there is a lot to address here. What is interesting, I think, is also to notice or to see a bit how the telework agreement has been implemented before the COVID-19 at the national level. And here we see different, reaction from the member states. Some countries, at least in 2008, because this implementation report is a bit old. So if there is people in the audience who are from the country I'm going to notice or mention, and that has changed, please let us know. Some countries adopted a limited application of the OSH provision in case of telework and actually reduced a bit the employer's liability on the basis that the employer cannot freely decide on how the design of the workplace is done at the home of the workers. And it has been at least the case apparently in Poland, Finland, and Austria, which in my view is quite, not ideal because the employer should remain responsible. Some countries decided to adopt no new legislation because they already had the principle of prevention and just said basically or emphasized that yes, it applies also informally to the remote work, which was the case for Latvia and Sweden. Some countries specified, yes, telework, same obligation, and it was the case for, I think, Slovenia and the Netherlands. And what is interesting is some countries have an extra duty saying that if you decide to go for telework, the employer has the obligation to check that everything is safe before it starts. And it is about the equipment, the installations, and that was the case for France, Luxembourg, and Hungary. And I know I have only 2 minutes left. What is interesting is because of COVID, there have been, once again, a lot of reform all over Europe dealing with the topic of telework. And what we see is really interesting. There is now more and more in the law, countries emphasizing that the financial burden shouldn't be on the workers and the employer has to pay for it. So I will just let you the list of countries here. It's called telework allowance. And one country, really important, Spain, put in the law on telework that employers are required to carry out a risk assessment on a remote employee's workplace. And that should not apply only to psychosocial, ergonomic, and organizational factors, but also to the accessibility of the actual work environment. Let's see what it will mean. But here there is really in the law that should be addressed. And also the people teleworking should be equally protected than people who are not teleworking. And that was my conclusion. So this is perfect. Once again, maybe I will just go to the way forward. What we might need now is acknowledge that telework can be beneficial, but represent also some risks. And it doesn't matter if it's an adequate measure for COVID. We cannot just use that as this is the end of the story. We still need to go a bit after in the end of the process of thought, and we need to discuss about how we make telework safe during COVID and without COVID or after COVID. There are general requirements that applies already now. So if there is workers rep, please start to have this discussion with their employer. How is going to pay? How do we address all these risks? And also we have a need for specific directives on musculoskeletal disorders and PSR for all workers in all time that will basically cover everyone and not only teleworkers, but also. Thank you very much. And this is the reference. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Aude. This is fascinating. And I was thinking when you were speaking about the coverage of the expenses because of the recent energy price hike throughout Europe. And if you are all day at home, you have to warm up your home all day, because in Belgium, you would normally switch off the heating when you leave, at least reduce it quite significantly. So this is also a question, maybe your employer should pay for some coverage of the heating costs, because they are now being doubled, tripled. I hear from some families, going for 200 euros to 600-700 euros per month at the moment, which is a bit high. Okay, so without further ado, I give floor to Sylvie, and then afterwards we will have the third presentation and then deal with the questions.
Thank you very much. So let's see if I can, voila, yeah, it's working. Okay, thank you very much, Zane, for the introduction, also for already giving this very energetic and punctual presentation. I will try to make justice to this very broad topic and connecting it with the future of work. So when I was thinking what to present at this indeed very engaging conference, well, I was thinking, okay, telework and future of work. There are two very broad trend and topics, and this exercise of putting them together prompted me and prompted us, I guess, to reflect on how to frame this apparently very harmless and practical contractual arrangement in the context of what will be the future of work or the way we will work in the future. This allowed me to reflect and to frame telework, and this is what I will try to show in the presentation. So to frame telework among those challenges and scenarios that are more and more distancing, alienating workers from those set of rules that are being established throughout time to protect and prevent harm to the dignity of workers. And we are talking about labor law. So we're going to frame telework as a possible challenge for the erosion of labor rights. It's a bit far-reaching, but there is some foundation in it. I will try to point it out. So this being the scenario and the, let's say, the intention, the goal, the presentation is going to be structured in 3 parts. The first part, I'm just going to show that telework apparently is going to stay beyond COVID-19. Then I will try to point out what are the challenges, what are the main challenges for labor law and the European labor law in particular. And then I will try to think whether we already have an arsenal of instruments to react to those challenges. So starting with the first point, the presentation before mine already made very clear that telework has been exacerbated by COVID. It was already existing, there were already arrangements, but for the intention of some workers, but also for the willingness of certain businesses and employers, teleworking is not going to disappear after COVID. This at least is what seems. Certain businesses indeed have been expressing the intention to embrace a permanent teleworking scheme and to make telework arrangement regular, permanent, depending on what type of share, but sometimes even 100%. So here is a list of companies, very famous, well-known companies that I found on internet that have recently adopting a permanent or semi-permanent teleworking arrangement. So you can read them, but we can see that some companies, among which Apple, Microsoft, and Dropbox, they have been allowing the 100% teleworking option. Facebook as well is developing a teleworking scheme. Adobe, for our PDF, is as well promoting a 50% teleworking arrangement. We don't only see this big tech company, but we also see some banks. I mentioned there Capital One and is introducing a 100% teleworking scheme. Also another bank nationwide is has adopted the slogan whereby people can work from whenever they want. This, however, has entailed the fact that the bank will close 111 of its physical branches. So we see that with this teleworking trend, there are also tangible arrangement that will impact also the future of work. Then another, I think, quite well-known approach regarding telework was taken also by PwC, the consultancy firm that I remember mentioned quite happily, that the worker could start working whenever they like and leave whenever they like. And this is why telework was adopted as a permanent telework, as a permanent contractual arrangement. Okay, so these big companies are setting somehow, we cannot yet see whether it's a trend. Well, I forgot to mention Amazon among them. Not sure what is a trend, but it's quite a statement. What are the common traits among those companies? Well, it's quite easy to point the fact that this company can allow that because they are global companies. They're everywhere, and they have strong reliance on high level of digital and AI tools. So these allow the teleworking. However, there is also a note of skepticism when reading that those companies have been so willing to embrace a teleworking trend. Maybe I'm a pessimistic in nature, but the question is, well, what if telework is actually a vehicle to promote and foster a new narrative about the modern form of work, modern way of work that this company are trying to engage? Indeed, I mean, it's not at all a novelty that big companies, especially big tech companies, are trying to promote a new narrative about the future of work. So this is a bit the argument that telework is going to stay after COVID. Then, as promised, let me pass to the second point of the presentation. So if we assume this telework is going to stay as a trend, as a structural trend, what are the challenges for labor law? So labor lawyers, so labor policymakers, what are the points that should be worrying for them? Well, one thing that comes to my mind, there are many, absolutely, but one thing that comes to my mind is the difficulty in applying existing labor norms. And here I'm just referring to a group of this norm that came up in my mind about European legislation. So I'm, for instance, thinking, okay, like we talk about the fact that nationwide closed 111 branches, and then that made me think, okay, how do we in the future deal with layoff and collective dismissal when we talk about telework? Because the current EU legislation refers to the notion of establishment as a threshold to determine the application or not of the legislation. Not saying it's impossible, but it's a challenge. How do we measure, how do we consider, what is an establishment if our working environment is digital? The same goes for, as already been mentioned by all before me, well, the challenge to apply correctly European law on information consultation rights, as well as the exercise of collective rights. How do we strike when we telework? There are ways, but is it not logging in, is getting online? That could be also framed, and there is a need of rethinking about that. As well, for the exercise of information consultation rights, EU legislation relies on the notion of establishment and of undertaking. Again, in a world where the company, the business allows telework from all country, all situation, how do we identify establishment and undertaking? Again, another example is a directive 2001/23 on transfer of undertaking, providing certain rights for workers in case of business restructuring. Well, the application of this directive relies on the acquisition of assets from one employer to the other, and this is one of the criteria to determine the application of the directive. But how do we conceive an asset now in a fully digitalized working environment? Also, these will need to be rethinked and reconceptualized, I guess. So this is one first set of difficulties. Then there is a second one, more pertaining with the title of my presentation, is the fact that there is the impression, there is actually already a tangible proof that those companies that we mentioned a couple of minutes ago are promoting a narrative whereby teleworking is associated with a higher level of flexibility, autonomy, freedom, and happiness in a way. For sorry.
We have to say CCME. So
somebody. Okay, it's back. So, no worries. So, yeah, there is a narrative that telework is associated with a high level of flexibility, autonomy. And this narrative, the narrative of flexibility, is something to get worried about, in my opinion. Why do I say so? Well, at the HUI, we were discussing about, when we were still forced teleworking, we were discussing about the trend of telework. Nicola Conturis, our director, asked us to give a look to the emerging report that certain firm, company, consultancy, employer association were putting forward. I've been reading them a bit, and here I gave the example of 3 of those, and they're quite worrying because in outlining this amazing future of flexibility and autonomy, they never consider the risk of this for workers. So we have, for instance, the American Enterprise Institute talking about that telework will allow flexibility for working hours, will allow workers to freedom in deciding how to accommodate their needs and desire. Deloitte, in the Future of Work report, was indeed saying that the future of work and telework will be associated by a switch to more flexible employment contract, and that this will weaken the relationship between employer and employee. This was a sort of forecast. the more functional situation and role for workers will be more and more independent contractors, self-employment, freelance work. Then there is another report, quite worrying as well, very lengthy, about drafted by McKinsey, where actually it's quite interesting because they say, well, in a world of telework and fully digitalized telework, the focus will not be anymore on whole jobs, but on-demand tasks. So there is going to be probably a shift to gig jobs, and flexibility is what accommodates this trend is gonna be the key. A survey of 800 business executives showed that the 70% among them reported they intend to hire more and more independent workers. So this is what prompted the question. Are we perhaps going towards a crowd workization of labor? Is this the trend that this practical arrangement of telework and its structuralization in our working life is leading us to? Well, this, in my opinion, is quite a scary and worrying scenario, but can also trigger some constructive thinking to let us think, okay, how do we face this? Because we know that when employer and big businesses are trying to promote a narrative, we should be alerted to understand how to dismantle that narrative, or at least the most dangerous part of it. Well, having this comparison or this possible scenario of the crowd workization of labor triggered by telework allow us to think that actually we do maybe have some tools already to dismantle this narrative. We have already a small arsenal of resources, and these are the tools that we have been gathering through the development of jurisprudence and legislation in relation to platform work and platform economy. So there is absolutely no time to dig into that. The effort will be immense. However, let me just point at 3 possible resources indeed that we learn through the platform economy. The first, it is indeed possible to challenge the concept of autonomy and the narrative of autonomy. Digitalization technology may facilitate this narrative, but there are legal tools and evidence to dismantle as well that autonomy that have been emerging from jurisprudence and case law on platform works. We have case law in Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Finland, and the UK, and emerging many other jurisdictions where it has been shown that remote control, pervasiveness of algorithmic management are instruments that are necessary. That are elements that point at the lack of autonomy. The fact that instructions are given via digital platform, the fact that tariffs or wages and salary are determined by the platform and not by the worker. All these elements can be again borrowed by our knowledge about platform work and transposed to dismantle this narrative. A second element is that a second tool is that it is indeed possible to go beyond the classificatory issue between self-employment and freelance work in order to provide certain rights to workers. In some countries, some legal system like Italy, there have been a development of a new, more comprehensive criteria that go beyond the autonomy, is the one of when workers are organized by a third entity, without talking about subordination and stuff. These may help. Or we have the application of the GDPR, as proved by case law in the Netherlands and Italy, non-discrimination law, anti-union behavior that may go beyond the classification issue, or even the human right approach that has not yet been tested in national jurisprudence, but may be quite promising. Finally, this is my, let's say, utopian and possible solution may also be the one to capitalize on the current policymaking effort at the EU level to introduce a sort of horizontal clause whereby the application of labor right is linked by the use of management through automated technology. So connect the fact that automated technology is a vehicle for management. So every time there is management via automated technology, labor rights should apply. This could be a sort of like vehicle or horizontal clause to not let our legislative system be bought and be carried away by the autonomy narrative. So this is just food for thought. There is no intention to provide a solution, and that's it for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. And we are exactly on time. Like everyone hasn't, both of our panelists have so far been exactly 15 minutes long in their presentations. And I very much like the issue you raised about where does telework debate fit in the debate on the platform economy? How do they interlink and how do they fit, and better they fit together? And in terms of the enforcement, something going towards presumption of employment relationship, which I think it's a very good road to go down. And without further ado, not to spend any time on my rambling, we'll give floor to our third panelist. So yes, the floor is yours, and I'm extremely interested in the topic of your presentation.
Thank you very much. So today I would like to talk about the private international law aspects of telework and remote work. I should say one thing, which is that in the field of private international law, so we obviously get a regular stream of cases on different aspects of transnational employment relations. But as far as I know, we haven't really seen any sort of big stream of cases concerning these relatively new practices of telework and remote work. So I think that what I'm going to say today is maybe a little bit speculative, and I think we'll need more sort of empirical evidence to see what the real problems are, that will then help us outline the solutions. So let me give you some background as to how private international law works in this field. So obviously, private international law deals with transnational employment relationships. So employment relationships that are somehow connected to more than one jurisdiction. And these relationships can be both individual and collective. And in the European Union, individual employment relationships and their private international law aspects are relatively heavily regulated, because we have, as Zana mentioned previously, the Rome regulation, the Brussels regulation, there's also the Posted Workers Directive, and these three instruments regulate quite intensively the private international law aspects of individual employment relationships. Collective employment relationships that transcend borders are not as heavily regulated. So the focus of today's talk will be really on individual transnational employment relationships and how private international law regulates them, and what are the kinds of problems that telework and remote work pose in this area. So private international law really deals with two essential questions. The first is if there is a dispute that arises out of an individual transnational employment relationship, which courts or which employment tribunals can hear the case. And then the second question is which employment laws, so the employment laws of what country, apply to the employment relationship. Just very briefly, when it comes to the jurisdictional employment tribunals and employment courts, the basic rule is that the jurisdictional courts depends on who the claimant is. So if the employer wishes to sue the employee, then the employer has to commence proceedings in the courts of the employee's domicile, so in the courts of the country where the employee lives. But if the employee wants to sue the employer, then there is a range of options that are available to the employee, but in practice, the employee will either sue the employer in the member state where the employer is domiciled, usually where the employer is incorporated or has its central administration or principal place of business, but also the employee can sue the employer in the country for the habitual place of work, so where the work is conducted. It is also quite important that choice of court agreements are quite limited in this field. So the employer cannot impose the jurisdiction of a court which is not the court of the employee's domicile on the employee. When it comes to the application of employment laws, the main principle is that it's the law of the country of habitual place of work that governs. And any choice of law can only build on the minimal protection provided by the law of the habitual place of work. So choice of law agreements, in other words, are quite limited in this field. And these basic rules that I set out, they basically work for the European Union and for the relationships that exist within the European Union. Now, obviously, transnational employment relationships sometimes concern third states, and that creates some problems concerning jurisdiction of applicable laws, but I don't think I have time to explore those, nor is that the focus of today's talk. So, what are the problems that telework and remote work pose? So, I think one thing to note is that these kinds of work arrangements were definitely not in contemplation of the drafters of the Brussels and Rome regulations. So you may know that the Brussels regulation is actually started its life as the Brussels Convention, which was adopted in 1968. The Rome Convention was adopted a little bit later, and I think back then no one really thought about telework or remote work, nor was it possible given the technological limitations at the time. So we are in an uncharted territory as far as private international law is concerned. And I think that there are really two basic scenarios, but I think in light of what I heard previously, there's probably a third basic scenario that should be considered on top of these two that I mentioned on the slide. So I think the basic scenario that telework and remote work create is what happened to many of us, or some of us, maybe even in this room, which is that before the pandemic, you have a more or less traditional employment relationship. An employee habitually works in country A, then something happens like a pandemic, and the worker can work from home or remotely, and the employer allows the worker to move to another country to conduct his or her work. So that is the first basic scenario that private international law has to tackle. But then the second basic scenario is, I think, what we are seeing now more often, that employers simply realize that they can start hiring people from all kinds of places. The virtual space is obviously not limited to one country, not limited to one member state. So you could have an employer from country A, from member state A, that advertises new positions and is willing to hire employees basically from wherever on the basis of telework or remote work. And I think the third basic scenario that I should add probably to this slide is the use of platforms, which means that employers simply do not want to hire employees, traditionally conceived, but they obviously want to hire self-employed people, or maybe people that they want to classify as self-employed. So how are these problems sort of translated in private international law terms? One question is whether teleworkers and remote workers are employees in the sense of private international law regulations. And I think this is quite important, because if a person who works for another is not classified as an employee, then the protections that I mentioned previously, the jurisdictional rules, the choice of law rules, the limitations on the effectiveness of jurisdiction agreements and choice of law agreements simply do not work anymore. So if a person who works for another is not classified as an employee in private international law sense, then that potentially opens up huge efficiency gains for employers, because they could simply hire people on a self-employed basis and impose the application of, let's say, Californian law or the jurisdiction of Californian courts upon them, regardless of where the employees come from or regardless of where employment is carried out. There's also evidence that I've seen that employers are hiring self-employed people and they're using arbitration clauses, which means that some employers at least are trying to exclude the jurisdiction of domestic courts altogether and refer disputes and the application of the laws to arbitrators, very often commercial arbitrators who, as you can imagine, are not particularly sensitive to the needs of workers, trade unions, or to the needs of labor. So that's one sort of big problem that arises. Another problem, so now I would like to focus on people who are classified as employees for the purposes of private international law. So one problem that arises for employers is that if they allow an employee to move from one country to another and work remotely from another country, or if they start hiring people from other countries, then the jurisdictional rules are quite significantly affected, because employers, if they want to sue their employees, they have to go to the courts of the country where the employee lives. And this, I think, is particularly a potential problem in sort of high skill sector of the labor market, where you have, I don't know, lawyers, bankers, tax advisors, and so on, who move to another country, who can work from home easily, then move to another country or are recruited in other countries. And then if disputes arise, for example, concerning the divulging of trade secrets, these sort of things, then employers have to go to the country where the employee lives to commence proceedings, and that can obviously increase costs for employers and create potential problems for them. But I think those two scenarios that I mentioned previously, the main question that they raise is really about the location of the habitual place of work. So if an employee is allowed to work abroad, or if an employee is recruited abroad to work online, then the question arises, well, where is the habitual place of work of this employee? And I would just like to very briefly mention how the Brussels I regulation and the Rome I regulation define habitual place of work. So they say that the habitual place of work is the country where or from where the employee habitually carries his work, or the last place where he did so. So the habitual place of work, if you remember, determines the application of labor laws to individual employment relationships, and it also defines the main place where the employee can sue the employer, which is, I suppose, what usually happens if a dispute arises. Now, telework and remote work may be relatively new scenarios, but there are some relatively old cases now that deal with the location of habitual place of work of people who work from home. And there are two European Court of Justice cases from the 90s, Mullocks and Rutten. And what these two cases show us is that the courts, when determining the habitual place of work, should take into account all objective and subjective factors. But the key factor is the location of the home office. I mean, it's not surprising. It's something that I suppose everyone would expect. But I suppose the important thing here is that we actually do have authorities that tell us that the application of labor laws and ultimately the main jurisdiction where employees can sue their employers is the place where the employee's office is situated. Now, what are the sort of legal problems that this creates? Well, I think the main legal problem is really the fragmentation of the internal labor market. So you end up with employers who potentially hire employees under many different applicable regimes. And I think that this is not really good for the trade union movement, because you eventually end up with a labor force that is scattered across the European Union, maybe in third states. They are subject to different applicable labor laws. And I think there's potentially little, at least that legally binds them, that would help them to sort of unionize and commence strikes or other forms of collective action. And there's certainly a potential to undermine EU employment legislation if the employers sort of structure their employment strategies in the right place, in the right way for them. So what are the solutions? As I said previously, all this is a little bit speculative because we actually do not have a trickle of cases that will show us empirically what the problems are. But I do think that the use of self-employed, abusive use of self-employed arrangements can be tackled through existing rules that we have. So in EU law, we have quite wide definitions of who employees there are many employment rules of EU origin that can be applied in an overriding way, regardless of where the work is conducted. So I think that some problems can be tackled through existing mechanism, but I think fragmentation, which is an inevitable consequence of all of this, I think this cannot be tackled very easily. And I think it's very unlikely that the Brussels I regulation and the Rome I regulation will be changed in light of these new problems posed by telework and remote work. So I think possibly the only solutions can come from transnational collective bargaining. And I think that like the institute potentially has a great role in actually researching what the problems are, proposing solution, and obviously participating in this transnational collective bargaining.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating discussion. I mean, I took a lot of notes from your presentation. So I will just go through the questions in Q&A session, and then I will give each of you floor to answer them shortly, and then I will conclude the panel. So first question is from Micheline. She asks, what are the legal loopholes to telework? So for example, in Belgium, apparently, a lot of employers consider telework to be house labor. I'm not sure whether that refers to really domestic labor, but house labor, and which basically allowed them to work on Sundays, the employees. And is this a phenomena restricted to a couple of countries or really wider? So another question by Luca, which I expanded into a direction I am actually quite interested in, was, so his question was, his point was that telework is maybe here to stay, but not as a big structural part of the working day. So then my extension a little bit towards the question is, what is this hybrid telework? So I work from home, I don't know, twice per week and work from office 3 days per week. How does it change my legal standing in terms of occupational health and safety, public, private international law, or autonomy and employment, and the notion of employment relationship? Is that the third way? Is that a separate category, or we are still trying there to distinguish the days I telework from the days I'm at the office? So that's something I'm a bit interested in myself as well. So I allowed myself to expand a little bit the Lucas question further. Then the third question is directed to Ode, because you mentioned the Spanish legislation. And how is in Spain the approval by the employer of the home workplace done? This is a good question. Is it done digitally? Because I imagine it can be with a camera, or is it done in practice in person? Do they have to come and check the home workplace? So it's a question for you. And then here, a question from Nicolas Villate. He was saying that in the chat that basically a lot of employers give workers a freedom of choice, sort of. They say, well, you can telework under the conditions you have at home and whatever, or you can come to the office where the normal conditions apply. And basically voluntary versus mandatory telework. For me, legally speaking, there is no difference in the tasks of the employer in that situation, but this is a sort of a loophole through which employers sort of, I guess, victimize a little bit and sort of put workers in a weaker position on purpose, I guess, to exploit this chance. So this is my question, whether you have seen something like that in those areas you work with, I guess, again, especially audit, because occupational health and safety is especially relevant there. And the last question by Giussi from Italy was, is there a difference between already, I guess, legally speaking, if we're all lawyers around the table, between telework, remote work, and notions like that? Because apparently in Italy, what is adopted is smart work concept, which also includes telework, but would be potentially broader. So is there something we see, I guess, at the national level yet? Because at the European level, we don't see that sort of classification yet, but maybe we do. And there are, obviously, because sometimes you do work de facto remotely, especially if you are, I don't know, driver, for example, and even if you're not teleworking. So yeah, so those are the questions, and I will start with Ode, then Sylvia, and then Agnieszka, and then we conclude.
Thank you for the question. I will try to address them briefly. So first of all, the housework, I understood it as indeed domestic work. I hope I understood right. Well, the definition technically of domestic work, and it's true, if you're domestic workers, you escape basically the rules of the framework directive. This is the only exception actually, but the ILO defines it as work performed in or for a household or households. So technically, this is actually that these domestic workers provide personal and household care. So this is really linked with the nature of the work. Then there is an exception that can be justified or not. This is another debate. But I think that traditional teleworkers shouldn't be qualified as domestic work. This is clearly an abuse of the law. And here, I mean, it's brainstorming, but I think there might be a case for actually qualification of this rules applying or not applying, and enforcing that this teleworkers have the right to benefit labor law and health and safety. Then about the hybrid telework, and even like the fact that if you choose telework, then it's under your own condition. No. Doesn't matter. Equalitarian and quite like technically, if you look at the law, there is like people teleworking should be treated equally and being equally protected, no discrimination between people working at the premises and people teleworking. The protection should be exactly the same and as high. So, I mean, once again, there is a gap between what the law is in theory and how it is in practice, but in theory, equal protection. And then about Spain, I have to say that, first of all, I'm not fluent in Spanish. Second of all, that has been adopted in 2020, which was the middle of the pandemic. Therefore, there was also the question also for the labor inspectorate or for people actually checking how it will be done, not in Spain, but more generally. So I don't know. But in the telework agreement of 2002, there is something saying, and then I conclude on that, that in order to verify that there is health and safety provision, they are correctly applied, the employer, workers' representative, or relevant authority have access to the telework place with the limit of national legislation and collective agreement. And if this is home, then you have to ask the agreement of the workers before you enter. The question is, what happens if as a worker you say no, and then something happens? But technically, this is the quick answer. We can keep going with that like later at some point. In the
follow-up to this.
In the follow-up, yeah.
Exactly. So thank you. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question and challenging questions. I will be telegraphic and only approach the hybrid arrangement, because that relates more with the notion of autonomy and the issue of autonomy. Well, I think, again, the tools we have, the knowledge we have gained in relation to the platform work, the platform economy can be a resource in this case. Well, if we approach the fact that teleworking is anyway happening in a space which is not necessarily what we talk about the usual place of work or geographical space, but is a digital environment, and we start considering that our working space and the space where we receive instruction, when we receive assessment and control on our performances, then we see a continuity between the work we exercise when we are physically in an office or at home, because this is happening in this digital environment. So this could be a way through, but it's just my own thinking.
Thank you.
I think the question of taxonomy is quite interesting. So the difference between remote work, telework, and other similar arrangements. So I would definitely encourage more thinking about that, see what the difference is, and to what extent different legal regimes should apply to these different kinds of work practices. I think really the main point that relates to my presentation is hybrid forms of work. So you could have situations where one person works, let's say, for an employer in Belgium and comes to the office twice a week, but they also have an office in their home in the Netherlands, and the question is, what law governs? Again, private international law operates by linking the employment relationship to physical spaces, so that clearly is not hugely suitable for online workspaces. That's obviously clear. But the good thing is, I suppose, that these kinds of problems have arisen in the past, even before the rise of telework and remote work. So we do have a case law where people had a home office in one country, but they also had an office in the employer's premises in another. And what the courts did in the past, and what I'm sure they'll continue doing in the future, is really try to assess which of the two offices is more important. And if they're equally important, then they take into account literally where the employee spends more time. Also, the intentions of the parties are quite important. So if the parties envisage that more work in the future or substantial part of work will be done in one of those two places or more places, then that becomes more important, and the employment relationship gravitates towards it. But it's an important question for, I think, the theory of private international law. How do we adjust this discipline, which is based on territorial connections, to basically online borderless space? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this is a similar question for labor law, because labor law functions largely on the basis of principle of territoriality. So how do we respond to these phenomena? I think response is probably European to a large extent, but how do we do it in practice is a different question. So,
well, the one problem is if many employers, from America or other countries, as you mentioned in your presentation, obviously, but involves space, physical space outside of Europe as well as digital.
Exactly. So, but then we go towards international agreements, and that we really need them also regarding employment relationship. And I know that there is this big discussion how much employment relationships should be regulated globally via private international law. So thank you so much to all my panelists. The three things I mentioned, I noted down for me to conclude with was that I guess what we need is, we need rules for sure, but we also need legal certainty, because at the moment what we are speaking about a lot of the time are very sort of fluid, sort of soft concepts, not really clearly applicable in practice, which then creates problem, and then creates problem exactly for those workers who already face problem in enforcing their rights. So this is, I'm a bit into enforcement discussions, and then a little bit, and then this is a big issue. If there's no legal certainty, no information, and if the habitual place of work is a highly interpretable notion, it's very difficult to figure it out in practice. And what I also very much like, and I think we need to talk about that much more, is the internationalization, transnational representation of workers and workers' voice across borders, because I think the reality has sort of caught up with the trade union movement in terms of having to figure this out right now and here, rather than postponing it for later. So on this, I would like to conclude, and we have a coffee break for those in the room. Thank you so much.
Dramatic rise of telework. Now the question then, of course, is, and we've heard already, for instance, in the last panel by a couple of our colleagues, Odd, for instance, and also Professor Grusic, that there is challenges for trade unions in this regard, but perhaps, or I would argue, also likely opportunities. And this will be addressed by our panelists today. Unfortunately, our third panelist, as you can see, we are now having two names on the list. Our third panelist, Bruno Demetre, unfortunately for health reasons cannot join us. So we will have two presentations by our panelists. And our first panelist is Julienne Beer. Julienne, it's a pleasure to have you. And Julienne is head of trade union policy at the ETUC. And she will address the framework agreement that was already agreed upon 2 decades ago, almost, on European level. And then we also have Kurt van Derle, a senior researcher in my unit. So Kurt, it's a pleasure to have you in this panel. And he will address the topic of unionization and remote work. And Kurt is focusing in his work on trade union renewal. So it's quite fitting that you're taking this topic on. And I will not take up more time. And Julienne, the floor is yours, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. And for those watching, please feel free to post any questions that you have in the Q&A section of this session, and we will get to those in the Q&A after the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. First of all, can you hear me and see me well? Yes, it's the case. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. In fact, dear Marcus, dear colleagues. So first of all, I would like to thank the ETUI for organizing this very interesting workshop on telework and to invite the ETUC to contribute to that very important topic. And that's a pleasure for me to be there with you today and to introduce our autonomous framework agreement on telework, indeed signed a few years ago. So in this presentation, I would like, first of all, and that would be the main focus of the presentation, to share with you the content of the agreement, of course. But not only, I would like also to end my presentation about what are the priorities for the ETUC on telework. And last but not least, I would like to tell you a few words about our COVID watch on initiatives and some initiatives linked to this COVID watch. And I will tell you what it means exactly. We're focused on telework, and I would like to draw a few conclusions from that, especially for the next steps, which are now really open at European level. And here again, I will explain you in what way. So first of all, as I promised, the content of the agreement, and I have a PowerPoint. I will share it right now, and give me just 1 second to do it. Here we are. So you should see it right now. Now full screen. Woo. Voila, here we are. Now you should see the presentation. Very good. Sorry for this technical problem. Suddenly it disappeared. So here we are again. So as I said, the first part of the presentation focused on the content of the agreement on telework, which was, as Marcus said, adopted in 2002. So the signatory parties for autonomous agreements at European level are the European social partners, so the ETUC for the trade unions, European Trade Union Confederation, and 3 employer organizations for the employers. So at this moment, UNICE, who's now Business Europe, UAPME, who's now SME United, and SIP, who's now SGI Europe, so the 3 employer organizations for big companies, SMEs, and public sector. This agreement is an autonomous agreement. So what does it mean in practice? Is that it's not a legislation, which is a directive and then which follow the legislative process. No, it's an autonomous agreement, which means that the European social partners have to implement, or their members, to be precise, this agreement at national, sectoral, or company level. So that's another process to implement agreements, and that's the case for telework, where our affiliates, respectively, have to meet jointly at national level to implement it. So now about the content of the agreement, and starting with the definition and the scope. So first of all, a general comment. So this agreement is really a short and focused agreement. I heard sometimes that it is outdated, that no, it's not correct. Some colleagues this morning have shown that some provisions of this agreement are still discussed right now and are very important, and that still remains the case. And some aspects, because of course it was signed 20 years ago now, can be certainly improved, but that's a question that we can address at the end of the presentation. So now starting with the definition and the scope. So you can see in the first bullet point here the definition, which is a simple definition to cover all circumstances and practices. So I will read it with you. So telework is a form of organizing and performing work using information technology in the context of an employment contract relationship, where work, which could also be performed by the employer's premises, is carried out anyway from those premises on a regular basis. So as I said, general definition, we cover all circumstances and practices. Of course, this agreement covers teleworkers, and a teleworker is any person carrying out telework as defined above. What is also very important in this agreement, first key element, the voluntary character. So telework is voluntary for the worker and for the employer concerned. Teleworking may be required as part of a worker's initial job description, or it may be engaged in a voluntary arrangement subsequently. So here you understand that we're not talking about telework in the context of the pandemic or of the lockdown, of course, but about how to adapt telework in the different workplaces. So in both cases, the employer provides the teleworker with relevant written information, legislation, collective agreements, or the description of the work performed, for example. If telework is not part of the initial job description and the employer makes an offer of telework, the worker may accept or refuse this offer. And of course, the other way around, if a worker expresses the wish to opt for telework, then the employer may accept or refuse it. The passage to telework as such does not affect the teleworker's employment statute. So it's really the link with the previous panel right now. So a worker refusal to opt for telework is not a reason to terminate the employment relationship or changing the employment condition. So that's very important. That's also mentioned in the agreement. If telework is not part of the initial job description, then the decision to pass to telework is reversible by individual or collective agreement, and the modalities are established by this agreement. Another important aspect of the agreement, the definition of the employment conditions, and here again, strong link with previous presentations. So the teleworkers benefit from the same rights. That's clearly written black on white in the agreement, as comparable workers at the employer's premises. So that's totally clear. However, we need specific complementary collective and or individual agreement, and that can be, of course, necessary simply in order to take into account the particularities of telework. Data protection and privacy, which are also topics which were addressed in the recent agreement negotiated with the employers on digitalization last year. So on these specific issues, what do we say? First of all, that the employer is responsible for taking the appropriate measures, notably with regard to software to ensure the protection of data used and processed by the teleworker for professional purposes. So here, the employer informs the teleworker of all relevant legislation and company rules concerning data protection. And the teleworkers are responsible to comply with these rules. Second element, the employer respects the privacy of the teleworker. It's not defined more than that in the agreement, and it's probably something which is to be let's say, developed right now. About the equipment, health and safety, and organization of work, here again, strong links with the previous presentations, and here general comment about really the collective approach that is defined here, and which is, of course, of importance for trade unions. So all questions concerning work equipment, liability, and costs should be defined before starting teleworking. And as a general rule, the employer is responsible for providing, installing, and maintaining the equipment. So if the telework is performed on a regular basis, the employer has to compensate or has to cover the costs directly caused by the work, in particular, those relating to communication. That's perfectly clear in the agreement. Health and safety now, as I said, already mentioned, especially in the previous panel, the employer is responsible for the protection of the occupational health and safety of the teleworker. So it's up to the employer to give the information to the teleworker on the company policy on health and safety. Third aspect in this slide, organization of work. So within the framework of applicable legislation, collective agreements, company rules, the teleworker manages the organization of his/her working time. So workload and performance standards must be equivalent to the comparable worker who are working at the employer's premises. And it's up to the employer to ensure that the measures are taken to prevent that the teleworker can be or can feel isolated, and that's also very, very important. Two other key aspects, and I will finish with that, with the description of the agreement: training and collective right issues. So basically for these two topics, the main message is we have to have the same rules, the same rights, and the same opportunities for all workers, teleworkers or not teleworkers. So here on training first, teleworkers have the same access to training and career development opportunities as comparable workers at the employer's premises and are subject to the same appraisal policies as these other workers. So they have to receive appropriate training as well, in addition, and it's another specification in the agreement, targeted at the technical equipment with the different characteristics forms of the work equipment. And we also that in the forced telework that we experienced in the last 2 years, the fact that, of course, we needed to acquire new skills to be able to connect online, like this kind of meetings, and to adapt our skills to this new environment. Collective rights issues. So here it's the same. Teleworkers have the same collective rights as workers at the employer's premises. No obstacles are put to communicating with workers' representatives. So the same here, but they should, as the other workers work in the employer's premises, participate in the elections in the company and in the different bodies representing workers, and workers' representatives are informed and consulted on the introduction of telework. So in a nutshell, that was the content of this agreement. And I have to say that between last year and this year, I was very often invited to present it. And the feedback I had is that it was really a source of inspiration, but not only to put again negotiations of telework at different levels, national, sectoral, or company level. So now another slide, as promised, about the ETUC priorities on telework, and I tried to summarize it in 6 points. So first of all, and that's very key, and the choice of the word is very important, voluntary dimension. So telework is really the workers' choice. So workers should have a clear right to telework and a clear right to return to work as well. So workers should, of course, know how to request, to make the request to telework, and how they can be considered and how decisions are made. So keeping in mind that in most of the cases, that's what we saw, teleworkers and workers want a blend approach. Second key message from us, equal pay and treatment for teleworkers. So it is really unacceptable to see that sometimes in practice, employers seek to pay less or to pass over teleworkers for promotion and etc. So that's simply not acceptable. Third element, telework support payments, which must be paid, of course, to the workers to ensure that all workers can work in the good conditions and do not bear the costs, equipment, running costs, and all the direct or indirect work costs. Fourth point, and to privacy invasive surveillance. So here, first of all, workers need to know. It must not be excessive. And the third point, workers must be able to switch off. And that's also the link with point number 5, work-life balance. And I was, very interested about the presentation of my great colleagues, Kalina and Paola before, also on the gender dimension of the whole issue. That's also very, very important to address work-life balance in that context. And here I added including the right to disconnect. And I would like to make a specific comment here because sometimes there is a confusion between the two. And, the right to disconnect is only one aspect of telework, and we can't reduce also the right to disconnect to telework. These are two separate topics because, of course, the right to disconnect is not only for teleworkers, but for all workers. Last but not least, health and safety, including online harassment that we saw that was present also that is present in that context. So that must be addressed. So including online harassment, but not only ergonomics, organization of work, and demands and so forth, for example. Now, a very last slide. I know there are two speakers and we maybe need time also for the questions after. COVID watch, lessons learned and next steps. So telework is by no means a new issue. That's demonstrated, and this agreement is another evidence about that. So that discussion, as we said, started 20 years ago in the context of the European social dialogue already. But I would like to insist about what our COVID watch mainly on restructuring and social dialogue shown on telework, which was one aspect of this COVID watch. So the ETUC in the context of the pandemic has developed these tools, this COVID watch, on different topics, which collect information, agreements of what happened at national level on these different issues. And what we learned from that is that there is a massive increase in the number of people working from home. Of course, that's obvious now, but that was really the case everywhere, where we really saw that in this 40% of the European workers report that they have started to work from home as a consequence of the pandemic. That's an important information. And the other elements is the necessity to ensure the good lessons that must be learned from the huge efforts made by workers in that context. First of all, that workplaces which already had telework arrangements embedded in collective agreements have been best placed to adapt to the challenges during the lockdown. And the second very important lesson is that collective bargaining is fundamental to allow telework to facilitate a safe return to work and a quick and fair recovery. So really the negotiated solutions, the importance of social dialogue in that context, and of course the role of trade unions and the respect of their prerogatives in that context were key and really success factors. Another important information that I wanted to share with you is the new agreement negotiated on digitalization last year, where there is, also in this agreement, the commitment to a negotiated and agreed change of the use of ICTs. And this agreement, also provides the modalities and the definitions on how to negotiate the modalities of connecting and disconnecting, the respect of the working time legislation and working time provision, the additional hour out of our so when an employer contacts a worker, the worker is not obliged to be contactable, and the worker has to be compensated for extra time. So all these provisions, in addition to what was negotiated in the telework agreement, are complementary. Possible next steps, and here it's not written for a simple reason, and I'll be happy to explain that in more detail if needed. It's because we are currently negotiating the next work program with the European employers. And of course, telework can be one of the issues. We don't know yet. So we just started these negotiations, and the work program should start next year, the new one, and we don't know yet which issue will be put in this work program. That's why for the follow-up as social partners to this agreement, I will remain silent today, but what I can tell you is that it's of course one of our concern, and we'll see how we will deal with it in the future, and if the agreement will be revisited or not. That's still a question mark about the how. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to reply to your questions later.
Many thanks, Julianne, for this overview and comprehensive tour of the last 20 years, where we come from, but also where we are going. Very important. And I'm glad to see also there's also Uni Global has also a list of principles that they have published earlier this year. And I saw you tick exactly all of them also in your presentation. So there is indeed alignment, if I see that correctly, of the global trade union perspective on this, and of course also the European Trade Union Confederation's perspective on this topic. We have a couple of questions, and please feel free to still add those for the audience. And we will first go to the presentation of Kurt, and then we will come back to all those questions all together, and then we will address them at once. Kurt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcus, for this.
And I look forward to the discussion now with you. And we have a couple of questions raised already in the chat, and I would like to start with one by well, that's more and also a link to the previous panels. And I know this has been addressed already, but I think it's worth resuming this question of voluntarism that Julien, you raised, right? So it should be voluntary to conduct telework, working from home, both from an employee's perspective and also from an employer's perspective. But then this shifting of responsibility. So how would you like to address this as Trade Union Confederation, also with the affiliates? Because there's of course a tension between this voluntarism and then at the same time this shifting of responsibility. So and there have been, and we heard that also in other sessions, there are trade-offs that are being made between employers and threatening to, well, then you can just come back to work in the office full time, or you take a lesser standard than what is also prescribed by law in a lot of countries when it comes to telework. So maybe we start with this question for you, Julien.
Thank you very much. And indeed, that's so the voluntary dimension is very important. But I have to say that I saw that in the question was also a bit precise about the fact that this was how it was negotiated in this company. The fact that, you know, so the employer and certainly the trade unions and the workers decided to have a certain number of days, so structural telework per week. So then in this situation, if it is jointly negotiated and jointly agreed, this is not illegal. That was also the question. And this is what is important. So then it's again taken into consideration what the trade unions and the workers represented by their unions negotiated and wanted. So here I presume that it was based on a voluntary approach, because this is how the structural telework was negotiated. So here in that specific situation, if it is negotiated with both parties and with there is an agreement about the fact that this is how it will work, then it is not illegal. The thing is that if it's not at all discussed, it's not at all agreed, and then the workers, of course, is forced to do. I'm not talking about, of course, the pandemic and what's happening right now in Belgium since yesterday, for example, where we have all of us to telework again 4 days per week. In a normal situation, let's put it like that, you according to us, you can't be forced to telework, and it has to be a solution jointly discussed. And of course, if you're a teleworker, as I said, same rights. If you're not, same rights, and it can't be used as an excuse to fire you or to let's say not for you to diminish your rights. Let's put it like that.
Thank you. And then indeed, making this also irreversible, to follow up briefly, because indeed that is Micheline's question, that is also not okay, right? So an employee can always opt in back to go back to work in the workplace. Because otherwise you're locking in employees and also those who join later the company. From a labor perspective, you cannot expect them, if you have a voluntary decision between working from home or at the office, you cannot expect
exactly
that, unless safe, of course, that trade unions within a collective agreement or employee representatives agree upon this. Just a short, if I may, a short addition to that. And I also refer to Pillestrauss-Rath's point indeed there of the shifting of responsibility. So in fact, we tackled 2 questions at once with your answer. Many thanks, Julien. And then maybe a question with regards to the connection and the chatbots, Kurt. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit? I know it's really difficult and there is no data, but maybe can you elaborate a little bit on the practicalities there, because there's also this question from Michael Eisen. I'm very sorry to everyone if I don't pronounce the names according to your national languages, but asking on empirical research on this, that there is a strain on employee representatives. And are you seeing this also in your research, Kurt, that this is indeed an issue, and how then using these digital means could ease that and overcome these challenges that employee representatives are having in connecting to the employees at the work floor, both employee representatives and trade union representatives?
Okay, thank you for this question. As far as I know, there's no research on this. I think we only know it by anecdotal evidence that it's difficult for union representatives to connect with remote workers. And indeed, the whole, I think part of my presentation is how digital organizing could help union reps to connect again with remote workers, either within unionized companies or within companies that are not unionized. And I think it's important if unions embrace or develop further digital organizing, that it's about servicing, but also about organizing. And therefore, I think this means a co-creation process of digital organizing tools. So there's the involvement of the workers and the union reps, and then also the people, let's say, more on the technological side of digital tools. So it's a two-way process: the involvement of the workers and union reps, and then also the technological people.
Yeah, and also the point, thank you, Kurt, that Julianne mentioned, right, that there was an agreement last year already on the digital aspects, that this is very much taken on board. We also will have the Digital Services Act coming, so there is a lot in the pipeline indeed, and lots of work cut out for the trade unions to make sure that social rights are in this context respected and fostered. And then the flip side of this, right, is this right to disconnect. And Julianne, you already mentioned this, but we also have a question from Isira Bahenda in the chat on this. Is there a right to disconnect at the moment with regard to work-life balance? And could you maybe reflect on this? And also, where you said that the negotiations are ongoing and you cannot preempt this, of course, but maybe a little bit more on this point of right to disconnect, because this is, of course, already mentioned also in the previous presentations today, right? That this is one of the crucial, downsides of teleworking, working from home.
Thank you very much for this question on the right to disconnect. Indeed, it gives me the opportunity to complete also the presentation, and it's a bit complex, I have to say. So the right to disconnect, yes, it does exist, but it does not exist everywhere in the same way, and we don't have any European legislation about the right to disconnect. So as you know, there was a report in the European Parliament pushing for a directive on the right to disconnect. And as you see, we also have a strong position on the right to disconnect, and we do see the added value of a European legislation on that topic, which would really complete very well the agreement that we negotiated on digitalization. So here in our agreements, just to recap what we wrote in this agreement. So we're not talking about the right to disconnect, but about the modalities of connecting and disconnecting. And here, what we explain is that, first of all, when we talk about the right to disconnect, we must respect the working time legislation. We must respect the working time provisions in collective agreements and contracts. For any additional hours, out of hours, when the employers contact the worker clearly is not obliged to be contactable and to respond to this call. And if there is extra time, this extra time must be compensated. So that's what we have in the European agreement, joint agreement with the social partners. In addition to that, the ETUC has also adopted a resolution on the right to disconnect, where we define it, where we say that there is a right to switch off, that's sure. This right should apply to all workers, all sectors, and we recall that the time which workers is available and reachable is working time here again. So we say it in a stronger way in our resolution. We mentioned the importance of workload as well, the importance of receiving information about the working conditions, privacy, training, how to use the rights. So, and here, this is where we are for the moment. Question mark about a possible initiative, legislative initiative of the Commission on that topic in the coming months. Same question mark for telework, by the way. And for us, the message is clear. They have to be separated initiatives. I explained why, because simply the right to disconnect does not apply only to teleworkers, but to all workers. And in addition to that, what we also saw at national level when we negotiated our agreement on digitalization is that there is really a mixed picture. There are mixed pictures at national level. So if some countries have already national legislation, like France, for example, where there is a definition of the right and then how to implement it is done by collective agreements. In some other countries, we have, let's say, zero provision and no discussion. So really, there are different situations right now, and it's a bit the same on telework, where we see that there is a huge progress in some countries or sectors and less in others. And that's why we are now in a transition phase about that. And we're really looking forward to discuss it in the future as well in various contexts.
Yes, thank you, Julian. As I said before, lots of work to be done, and of course a hot topic these days for obvious reasons. Now there is a question. Sorry that Kurt, that there's another question, but that's what the audience is coming up with these questions. But there's another question on for you, Julian, by Romek Jagodzinski, a colleague of mine, also from our unit. Now, Romek's question is: we discussed the opting in for employees for telework, but then his question is more or less, if employees want to telework and employer refuses, so should there be a right to telework for employees under certain circumstances, and what is the ETUC's position on that? So where they are, to maybe rephrase and then take the liberty here to do that as chair, if the circumstances permit, there are certain jobs that do not allow for telework, but where those circumstances permit, what would be then, is there the possibility for a right to telework, and what's the stance of the ETUC on that?
So for the moment, there is no right to telework. As I said, so even in the agreement, we don't define it as a right. It's really the voluntary approach. And as I said, right now, I can't reply to this question about the follow-up. It's not that I don't want, but we just started the negotiations on the work program. And again, if we have a negotiation on telework, which is not guaranteed now, or I can't say if it will happen or not, because simply we have not, let's say, agreed yet about the work program and to include telework or not. This, if it is the case, if it would be the case, then we would have to again go to our executive committee to adopt a mandate to revise the agreement on specific aspects. And really here again, I would not like to enter in this discussion right now, not because I don't want, but because I simply can't. So I would like to refer to the 6 ETUC priorities that were already discussed, but not more than that.
Okay, duly noted. I still tried. Thank you, Julian, for your answer. Now there is one more question by Jörn Janssen, and maybe Kurt, you can take that one. With regard to legal mandatory employee and worker representation, I could answer, but I'm the chair, so I would leave you the floor to do so, because in fact there are rights and obligations already in place, right? Kurt, could you take that one?
Okay, thank you. well, I'm a political scientist, so I don't know in detail all the legal requirements. But if you know more about this, Marcus, then please go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to put you on the spot. No, but indeed there is the Framework Directive 2014 on mandatory employee workplace representation for the European Union. So there are already rules in place, and we also have the European Works Council Directive for large companies, of course. So there are those employee representation frameworks, roughly speaking, on information, consultation, participation. But then I would presume perhaps that this is also with regard to telework and whether there is worker representation on that. And maybe you could elaborate there a little bit more, whether there are already developments in member states where telework and you refer to freelancers, for instance, whether they are already not legally mandatory because they are none, as far as I know, but you can correct me on that, but whether there are any national initiatives already on a broader scale on these topics in the member states so far.
Sorry, I would not know this, whether there are such initiatives for freelance workers. I know a bit more about initiatives about platform workers, but I guess this is only slightly related to the topic of remote work.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, there are initiatives, right, but they are not precisely related to telework. And as we just heard from Julienne, this topic is perhaps on the agenda in the near future, but this is still an ongoing development. So this is too early, I guess, to answer the question of Jon Jansen at this point, but we will get back to that later. Now, we have almost reached the end of the time and we are a little bit ahead of time. I would give the two of you the floor if you have concluding remarks that you would like to make at this stage, if anything was missed so far, Julienne.
Not really concluding remarks. I just would like to thank you again, Marcus, for this panel and for your way of chairing. I really appreciated that. Yeah, I'm simply looking forward to more discussions on this topic, and a little sign to Maria also from your team was, as always, very helpful in this preparation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julienne. Also, thank you, Court, for joining this panel, and for the audience for listening in. And indeed, many thanks to the organizing team that we are not seeing on screen, but they are indeed essential to make this hybrid meeting successful. So we now have another break, and then we will be back with the fourth panel later. Many thanks to the two of you again for your participation.
To our conference on telework, and I'm very pleased to chair the last session of the day, which is session 4. And for that, we have great speakers in our panel. First of all, in order of speaking order, is Professor Valerio De Stefano, who is Professor of Labor Law at KU Leuven here in Belgium. Then we have Janine Berg, Senior Economist in the Inclusive Labor Markets, Labor Relations and Working Conditions branch of the International Labor Office. Thank you, Janine. And finally, Professor Hamid Ekia, Professor of Informatics, International Studies and Cognitive Science, and Director of the Center of Research and Mediated Interaction at Indiana University in the USA. So this is a very international panel, which I'm glad to chair. And as in the panel before, each speaker, please provide us with a 15-minute presentation, while the audience can write comments and questions in the chat. And then at the end of the session, we will have hopefully a very lively discussion with all of you. So please, Professor Valerio De Stefano, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ponce del Castillo. It's a pleasure to be here. So I I wanted to start reflecting on how the pandemic has changed many people feel about work. So today we are going to speak about remote work, and I think that's a big thing in the shifting of the feeling of people towards work. But we should also reflect on the broader picture. And I think the broader picture also includes the fact that what the media have called the Great Resignation, the fact that many people have stopped or quit from the jobs, looking for better solutions or looking for different jobs if their working condition in their previous job were not satisfying enough. And one of the things that actually has driven this is also the ability for clerical workers to work from remote. So this thing really changed during the pandemic. The idea that you will be able to work from remote and that actually your employer should allow you to do remote work or hybrid work as much as possible has really seeped, in my opinion, in the way people think about work. And I think that the unions will have to accommodate these demands. We'll have to be at the forefront for these demands. I think remote work, of course, has many potential benefits. First and foremost, something that we weren't so careful enough before the pandemic in considering the fact that many work environments are felt to be oppressive by people. Managers and certain managerial processes can be felt really oppressive, and people are happy to stay away from those environments. On top of that, it seems that remote work can play a good role in enhancing work-life balance. And again, in this, we have to distinguish between what was remote work during the pandemic, where everything was closed, the schools were closed, so the carers were not there, and basically a lot of people had to shoulder a lot of responsibilities that normally would not have fallen onto them. But I think even if you ask the people that you would expect to be more impacted by additional work, many, including many women, surveys report that they will still prefer to keep on doing remote work or having an hybrid work arrangement rather than going back to the office 5 days per week. Other than that, of course, you save a lot of costs and time for commuting. It might be better for productivity, and definitely there's also an environment component that is saved from all the saving in terms of commuting. So again, I think that the unions will have to stay abreast of this. They cannot ignore the fact that many workers want this now. It is also going to be, in my opinion, a good campaign, a good topic for campaigning and organizing, and basically also gathering the support of people that otherwise would be less interested in union if unions both at the workplace and in the industries start fighting for better arrangement when it comes to remote work. So I'm all in favor of all this, but at the same time, we need to be careful about some downsides of that can be tied to certain types of remote work. Before going there, though, I think that one of the things that we also need to be reflecting about is how managerial prerogatives and the ways our legal systems organize and regulate work concentrate a lot of unnecessary power in terms of organizing the work relationship and the work performance of people in the hands of managers and employers that are allowed to take unilateral decision over the work of people, even when there is no actual organizational or business need to impose people to be present at the office or to work at certain fixed working time. I think that it is time for certainly for us labor lawyers, but also for the labor movement, to start thinking up to when the exercise of this unilateral managerial prerogative should be legitimate and lawful in a legal system that recognizes the quality of people and wants to grant the flourishing of people and the capabilities of people. Like at the end of the day, no legal system purports to the idea that they want to be oppressive. And I think this, again, the pandemic showed us that we can call into question some of the unilateral managerial prerogatives of employers and managers, precisely because things kept on working even when managing and reporting lines, particularly in the first stages of the pandemic, were basically interrupted. So we have to think about it, and I think remote work is a good way of thinking about it. Coming back to the possible downsides of remote work. Yes, many people feel a better work-life balance, but still we have a long way to go in terms of legal standards to guarantee the right to disconnect. The fact that people can work from home and use technological devices to be always connected can actually engender an increase in working time, an increase in working pace. People are expected to be available all of the time. So there is a definite blurring of the boundaries of work and life. And this is something that needs to be taken care of. Again, we cannot live with the same standards that we adopted during the emergency lockdowns. Those were emergential periods, but it's now time to start actually a very profound reflection on how to regulate and provide for a right to disconnect. Of course, there's the question of enhanced monitoring, and of course, our moderator, Aida, has done a lot of great work in that field. The fact that remote work also allows for technology to be used to monitor and supervise people and micromanage them, and also control what they're doing all of the time in very invasive, in some cases discriminatory ways that also can endanger the health and safety of people and produce psychosocial risk for workers. On top of that, something that together with Nicola Contouris, we have written in a blog a few months back for Social Europe, there is the risk that remote work is used as an opportunity to develop what we call contractual distancing practices. And what we mean by that is the possibility that the employers and managers use remote work as the opportunity to drive sham outsourcing, sham contracting out to bogus self-employed people, both workers that are already present in the workforce, and basically they get dismissed and their services are insourced back, then just basically outsourcing to other sources. I think that this is something that, for instance, McKinsey has presented as an opportunity for employers, the way to use the idea that they could use remote work to basically reshape the boundaries of the firm by ensuring a lot of control in their own hands, but at the same time shedding away the responsibilities. And this will be nothing new. I mean, this happened in the 70s and the 80s in the manufacturing services, where a lot of services were outsourced, in many cases to the same workers that were hired directly and were providing those services in the framework of an employment relationship. These workers were made contractors. And of course, we see that in platform work. And I think that this also shows how the debate about the platform work directive that we are having at the moment is not only crucial for the virtual workers of today, it is essential for virtual work and remote work and for the virtual worker of tomorrow. If platform workers, those that work online all of the time, don't get enough protection from the law and from the directive, this will create a huge incentive to transform remote work in the opportunity of the century to basically crowdsource through the apps and through the platforms activities to shame self-employed people. I think, therefore, that when we discuss the question of how to balance and regulate the work of platform workers, we also need to take into account that many people in the next future could basically be outsourced because employers want to take advantage of the fact that outsourcing somebody that works from remote, that is not present at the office, that you can basically not directly govern with working time and schedules, is going to be extremely, extremely easy for employees, much easier than trying to pretend that Uber drivers or Foodora delivery riders are actually employees. Are not employees. It's going to be much more difficult to fight back in litigation this kind of virtual relationship that occur in the virtual space. To take care of that, in my opinion, the best thing, the best option will still be fighting for a new way of interpreting employment status and basically getting rid of the traditional distinction between employment and self-employment and move forward to what Professor Kontouris and Professor Friedland have long purported, the idea of going towards a personal work relationship approach to the for granting protection in the labor market. Even if we stop short of that, in any case, it is about time to start thinking that the rights and protection of platform workers are not only about the ones that are now working for the platforms, it is really about the ones that will be outsourced very soon if we don't do anything to prevent that. And I think that's a huge challenge for the union movement. With that, I think I exhausted my time. Thanks a lot, and I'm very happy to stay for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Valerio De Stefano, for this very interesting and compelling summary. But just to come back, interesting, you have put a very interesting but fine balance on the benefits and risks of remote work. And then, of course, the specificity of the risks on platform workers. As you said, well, employees are present at work, not physically, perhaps, but in the virtual space. And this is what you insist in providing the specific protection. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Janine Byrne from the ILO. So please, Janine, take the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. My presentation, I'm going to share my screen. We'll pick up on some of the themes that Valerio discussed, and also a little bit also my colleague Umarani, who spoke in the first session this morning. So can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we see in the world of work and what are the broader implications. And kind of really, so I've titled this Globalization Meets the White Collar Class. And I really feel like there has been, as it is, a growing trend towards outsourcing of white collar activities. And this is certainly something that accelerated tremendously during the pandemic, with employers realizing that they could do this, and actually the workers were quite productive. And so in my opinion, I could see that there is going to be much more of this in the future. And of course, the implications are large, because a lot of this can be cross-border. And of course, not only is it difficult to comply with legislation in a virtual setting in the domestic sphere, but when you cross borders, it makes things that much more difficult. So let me just start a little bit with kind of a review of what's gone on in the world of work a little bit over the past decades. Of course, globalization started really with the outsourcing and manufacturing. Here, just to put up some data for the US, just because it was easy for me to find. This is the decline. This is the percentage of manufacturing versus all employees in the US and its decline over time. Some of this, of course, driven by technological trends, but a lot of it really, and structural transformation, but a lot of it driven by just the pushing out of outsourcing to the global South in particular. Now that could be a positive thing for the global South, but most of the literature that we have coming in is that a lot of these jobs are not really of the best working conditions. So here's just three really good books that I think capture very well the story of what's happened. The Walmart Effect is about really the pressure put on suppliers to lower prices and why they felt compelled to outsource. in order to deliver for Walmart, which is of course was the America's biggest retailer. Janesville is a story of a GM plant that closed in Ohio and the destruction that happened to that community and the difficulty that people had despite heavy resources on retraining in finding jobs that were of the same middle class level for that workforce. And Molly's Job is a book about a factory, a job that belonged to a woman named Molly, who lived in Paterson, New Jersey. And then the job went to the South in the United States in a right to work state. And then it went to Mexico. And then it shows you that even in the job that was in Mexico, it wasn't a job of very good quality. So, you know, you see this decline of the blue collar workforce and many middle class jobs in the global North. And then what we see later on was the shift then in outsourcing of business process outsourcing, back office work, call centers. And this is something, you know, a trend that started happening with the advances in telecommunications in the 80s and then really took off. And so this was something that was, you know, already quite accelerated. You had companies that had maybe back offices in other parts of the world where lower cost locations where you had a skilled workforce that could do the work but at a less price. But we're still either captive companies in that they were actually satellites of the lead firm, let's say in Europe or North America, or they were companies that were hired to do this type of work for the North American or European supplier. And so the difference is with the platforms and also with the trend in virtual, you know, in remote work and what I call virtual outsourcing, is the really big distinction that when you're hiring a firm that specializes in call centers or back office work in India or the Philippines or wherever that may be, at least that was a contract that was with an enterprise who then hired these workers as employees. And so some of those workers, you know, these were actually formal jobs in the global South. They might not have been, you know, they might have had some deficiencies in their working conditions, but some people might have considered them good jobs, but they were formal jobs with certain benefits and certain labor protections. With the digital labor platforms, this enabled companies to hire directly workers in different parts of the world. And then of course, with an independent contractor status and workers that have no place to go if they don't get paid, or if their working conditions aren't good, if there's problems, and so forth. So this is, to me, what I see as the big risk, not so much the movement abroad, which could be hurtful to, you know, workers in the global North, but the fact that with this new type of outsourcing, you don't have the protections that you have in an employment relationship, and it's very difficult to ensure that the law, you know, either to argue for your rights and to have those rights being reinstated and to have those rights be complied with. So just to give you a few examples of some trends that we see, this is actually a company, an Australian company that basically allows you to hire virtual assistants through a platform. So these are, you know, basically administrative assistants that can help you know, a business and located any part of the world. The platforms are set up where the worker is classified as an independent contractor. They live, of course, in a different country. They do have set working hours. They work either 4-hour days or 8-hour days. They have set breaks. They're required to download a time tracking management system that takes random screenshots and you know, monitors their keystrokes. And then this is used to record attendance and prepare payroll. And, you know, previously somebody who was an administrative assistant in an office job, let's say in the United States or Europe, that's usually would have considered basically kind of non-tradable. But with the real technological changes in the facility of now contracting abroad this kind of work and you know, the fact that you have nice video software, you can see the person, you can communicate in real time. This means that what was once considered an untradeable job has now become a tradable job. And so there's certainly an incentive for firms to consider doing this sort of contracting to reduce their costs. At the same time, we also know, I mean, this is this is actually here a picture from the Upwork platform, which is a freelancing platform. This ability then to just go on to, as a worker located anywhere in the world, to go onto a platform and to work means that there's been just a huge oversupply of labor that is problematic for workers because there is a really stiff competition between them. So this is back in 2019. This was posted on the Upwork community blog. This was the number of persons that were registered on the platform, over 2 million. Only 189,000 had earned over $1, and only 126,000 had earned over $1,000. So basically about 8% had actually earned any money on the platform. So just to give you an idea of really how this, this deluge of labor that certainly will work to drive down prices. So now with the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know this has been kind of the great working from home experiment. There have been some positive aspects to it, certainly. It's also been the ability to work from home during the pandemic meant that a lot of activities were allowed to continue. A lot of people's jobs probably were prevented from being lost because they were able to switch to working from home. So there's certainly been some benefits. But we also need to keep in mind that this has been primarily a high income phenomena, or an upper middle income country phenomena. So here just from some data. So prior to the pandemic, there were 60 million workers who were home-based, basically, prior to the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, this number more than tripled to 157 million. In upper middle income countries, jumped from 160 million to 231 million. But in low and lower middle income countries, the jump was actually quite small. So this is very much a story of high income countries and upper middle income countries. Just some data here on some of the shifts in particular occupations. Here for Argentina, Italy, United States, of course, the shift to working from home was very much connected with the type of work that you could do, which, that's obviously very logical, but, the shift has been quite dramatic. So among ICT professionals, 14% were working from home. Prior to the pandemic, it jumped to 75% in 2020 in the United States. In Argentina, jumped to 58%, so really quite substantial, and Italy to 50%. And then general and keyboard clerks, so this would be your virtual assistants, your clerical staff. We also see really important jumps as well, from 5 to 42%. So there is some lag. The jump hasn't been as tremendous in middle income countries. If you see Argentina, just 24%, but this is something that can easily be caught up with over time with the incorporation of technology and the use of it in workplaces. So one of the reasons why in some countries, the jump wasn't as dramatic as in high income countries is because a lot of the processes in the companies themselves required either, you needed to have a physical signature or a physical stamp. And so they just didn't really have the systems ready to make that quick switch to working from home. My expectation is that, now this is something that's going to be a real, this has been really an area of incredible investment during the pandemic and probably in the years after the pandemic. So I'm sure we're going to see an acceleration in a lot of this work in the post-pandemic period. We also know that there's been studies coming out about how the time that the working from home actually has worked, pretty well for many employers. Although there's been some concerns about slacking among their labor force, most of the data shows that if anything, the people are working longer hours. They tend to be using the time that they saved on commuting to working more. Overall, it shows that some of the concerns that management haven't been realized. There have been important productivity gains, and of course, as Valerio and others in this workshop have spoken about, there's also, of course, a lot of software to monitor workers and to make sure they actually are doing their job. So that makes a lot of management feel like this is something that they can more comfortably continue doing because they have that control that they had in a physical workspace. So here just some, we see every day in the newspaper companies announcing that, they're going to continue with working from home. It's here to stay. Some talk about hybrid workplaces. Some companies saying, no, we're never going back to the office. there's also a drive, of course, from some workers who don't want to go back to the office. But it looks like, it is something that despite the fears before the pandemic, it does seem to work, it can stay, and of course, it's cost effective. And the real risk is what Valerio, in my opinion, is what Valerio has just talked about in his presentation, is that the risk of misclassification of the employment relationship is very large. So right now, a firm might have their employee working from home, and that person, that contractual arrangement continues and everything's fine. But if that person quits or if that person retires, will the firm necessarily replace that worker with another employee, or will they see that they could either hire somebody through a platform or just hire somebody on some sort of informal working arrangement, where they don't have, and consider them an independent contractor, and they don't have the rights and benefits of the employment relationship. And of course, while this is difficult to contest in a domestic setting, contesting this in a global setting is incredibly difficult because of conflicts of law issues, because it's not really always clear, which jurisdiction should be covered. Usually it's where the worker is located, but are they going to go to their labor court and make a claim against an employer located halfway across the globe? It's very difficult. So to me, this seems like one of the biggest risks of the current trends that we're witnessing. There's other risks associated with permanent teleworking. There's also a lot of advantages. I'm not going to get into the advantages. I do recognize very much that there are some advantages, but we know that from the work we have done at the ILO last January, we published a report, my colleagues and I, on working from home and studying the pre-pandemic period, but there are important wage penalties for workers. If you take two similar workers, one who works from an office, one who works from the home, or one who works in a factory and one who works from the home, the person who works at home will suffer a wage penalty controlling for all of their characteristics. There's risks of digital presenteeism, of the feeling that one needs to be online and connected to show that they're working. There's of course risks about surveillance and workers' privacy, particularly if they're using their own computer to do their work. Less access to training and career development. Although now training systems, it seems that they are being accommodated a little bit so that they can be given during a virtual setting. The kind of more informal training that one would get working side by side a colleague in an office is much more difficult to replicate in a virtual setting. And this also has important consequences, particularly for young people and career development. And there's, of course, as many have spoken earlier today, on greater gender disparities. But I do want to talk about one possible positive political economy implication, is that in many ways, the politicians who haven't been that concerned, the policymakers who haven't really been that concerned with globalization and its impact on the manufacturing class or the pink collar workforce that whose jobs were outsourced as well, they might feel a little bit differently when it's their nephew or their grandson or their granddaughter or some member of their family who starts to see that their jobs are being chipped away as well. And so there might be some sort of recognition of this risk because it's affecting a class in the labor force that previously wasn't as affected, and which has obviously much more political power to change the course of legislation. So we'll see with time what happens. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janine, for your interesting presentation. It's always thought-provoking to see the emerging trends, the virtual assistants, the outsourcing, and of course, monitoring software and its cost effectiveness. And of course, the big question on the risks of misclassification of the employment relationship. And with that, I will ask Professor Hamid Ekpia to close this panel with the last presentation. Please, Professor Hamid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Aida. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. Well, let me start by thanking Nicola Contouris, Aida, Maria Nikolova, and their colleagues for organizing this. It's a pleasure, real pleasure to be here, seeing so many faces and names that I admire. I'm not going to name them, they know who they are, but it's really a pleasure to be with them. I didn't get the chance to listen to the first panel, but because of the time difference, but I woke up around 4:30 in the morning to listen to the other panels, which I greatly enjoyed and learned from. I'm not sure if I can add anything really new to the legal and expert commentaries that the people have made so far, but I'll try to make some provocations if you wish. I was encouraged to hear about the rights of privacy, disconnection, volunteerism by Julian Baer, but at the same time, I worry about the challenges of organizing, mobilizing, unionization, contractual distancing that Kurt Vandel described, as well as issues of psychological health, life-work balance, micromanagement, surveillance, digital presentism that Janine just mentioned, outsourcing, geographic variance, jurisdictions, employee misclassification, oversupply of labor, all of the issues that this wonderful speakers have talked about. It's a whole slew of issues that we have to tackle, and I'm not going to be able to do that. In the interest of time, I'm going to read some of my presentations so that I can get through the points. Let me just add also that what I say here mostly applies to the US context, not necessarily to Europe. So with that, the image that comes to my mind when I think about the future of work is the contrast between these two scenes. On the left, you see a modern and vibrant shopping mall, generously lighted, colorfully decorated, impeccably clean and shiny, and moderately crowded with human beings. Shoppers, salespeople, children, elderly, you name it. On the right side, you see an even more modern Amazon warehouse with industrial lighting, heavily packed with objects and populated with robots and machinery, but barely any people. I don't know about you, but if I were to choose between these two options as a place of work, I had no doubt which one I would choose. Even in the terms of job titles and job descriptions, it is not difficult to decide which one is more preferable. The standard titles in a warehouse such as Amazon's are water spiders, pickers, packers, amnesty teams, etc. This last one, which sounds very interesting, actually was described by an employee as follows. Watching an amnesty worker walk among the robots can feel a bit like watching a zookeeper mingle with lions. This is a trained professional who will be probably walking in and out of the cage without incident. Yet, you can't help wondering what are the chances that this person gets mauled. Another employee described their job at Amazon as a hot, miserable job where people are not allowed to go to the restroom and to have to pee in a coffee cup instead. I say all of this with a sense of guilt because I have to admit that I am not a big fan of shopping malls, finding them as epitomes of consumerist capitalism. Neither have I ever been a salesperson. I'm actually the worst salesperson ever. If a company hires me, they go bankrupt. But when I put myself in the shoes of thousands of people who used to work in shopping malls and now find themselves racing against robots in warehouses, I wish I had not been so critical of shopping malls. As the saying goes, we have to be careful what we wish for. That saying equally applies when I think about telework. To put this in perspective, let me step back and ask some basic questions. For a few years, I've been teaching a course on the future of work from the perspective of AI and automation. The purpose is for students to assess for themselves the risk of different jobs being lost to automation on the basis of standard analysis, such as the ones we see in this diagram and many other places. In the course, I ask students to identify a specific job or profession and to try their best to learn what the job exactly consists of. Or as I like to put, what does it take to be a good whatever, a good plumber, a good teacher, a good chef, a good coach, etc. The process is iterative, so they start with a simple model, the students, where they use the standard task-based analysis of the job, then they revise that to include social issues of class, gender, and ethnicity, and so forth. And finally, they turn that into a more comprehensive model, accounting for the more social, global, and historical parameters of work. By the end of the course, students have I think I skipped one slide, so let me move on. By the end of the course, students have a much better grasp of the complexities involved in jobs beyond simple task analysis, so they can critically evaluate predictions of the type made by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, as you see in this graph. I would like to draw your attention here to some of the job descriptions in this graph. At the top, we have manual jobs such as machine operators and farm work. At the bottom, we have jobs such as psychiatrist and legislator. Labor economists and experts use different other categories to talk about jobs, service, finance, manufacturing, hospitality, etc. But for my students, the majority of whom come from informatics, I try to explain these in less technical terms. For instance, productive and non-productive work. To avoid normative bias, I explained that students should not understand these terms in moral or evaluative terms. And of course, not all students have the same assessment of different jobs in terms of their productive or unproductive nature. Some consider jobs such as financial analysts, telemarketers, lobbyists, and the like productive. Others disagree and find them unproductive. In the opposite direction, some students put garbage collectors, dock workers, and janitors on the productive side, while others consider them low-skilled and marginal. I believe that my students are a representative sample of views in the larger society. Actually, commentators have different other ways of talking about jobs. David Graeber famously divided those same jobs that I mentioned into, I apologize for the term, bullshit or pointless jobs and real meaningful jobs. He describes the first category as jobs that are believed to be useless even by those who perform them. And the second category is, of course, the opposite. As a general rule, he shows that in modern societies, the more obviously one's work benefits other people, the less one is likely to be paid for it. But his main point is that the phenomenon of BS employment can provide us with a window on much deeper social problems. Comparing this to hell, he suggests that we need to ask ourselves not just how did such a large proportion of our workforce find themselves laboring at tasks that they themselves consider pointless, but also why do so many people believe this state of affairs to be normal, inevitable, even desirable. What Graeber describes as hell was brought vividly to light during the pandemic. When the COVID pandemic hit, we faced a whole new category of workers that in the US at least were referred to as essential or frontline workers, nurses, firefighters, garbage collectors, grocery workers, etc. These are the people whose work are so important to the well-being of the society and to the smooth operation of daily life that they absolutely cannot stay at home. As it turns out, many of the people who fall into this category also belong to my group A and Graeber's group 1 in our categories. The phenomenon of frontline workers introduced many important questions about the fairness of income distribution in modern societies. The answer to these questions came from a report from the conservative RAND Corporation, which examines the trends in income in the US in the last 40 years, comparing real wages against a counterfactual situation if the upward trends of earlier decades were to continue, in which case someone who currently makes $50,000 a year would have made $92,000. Please notice this difference. If the trends had continued, after the 1980s, somebody who earns 50,000 would have earned 92,000 now. According to the report, this difference between current reality and that counterfactual scenario amounts to $2.5 trillion. Trillion. The RAND report describes this as a transfer of wealth, but more accurate terms, in my opinion, are pillage, plunder, or even stealing. That's what has happened, in my opinion. This finally brings me to the core question of that asked in my course, which is also related to the future of telework. That is, the question of who benefits from modern technology and the possibilities that it has created. For instance, in telework. After COVID, I framed this question in the following form for my students. If automation and technology is as great as enthusiasts suggest, why do we have to put people's lives at risk in order to get very basic things done? I really don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know about you. I mean, there's a lot of hype about automation. To answer this question, the answer to this question has multiple aspects. The technical aspect has to do with the serious limitations of current technology. For performing mundane tasks such as that are straightforward for human beings. For example, flipping hamburgers or cleaning a bed in the hospital. Oops, sorry. I lost track of my slides again. The economic aspect of the answer has to do with the availability of a cheap army of reserve labor that Janine described around the globe that makes it still profitable for corporations to hire human labor rather than invest in technology. The only group that is apparently in short supply are so-called high-skilled workers. I prefer to call this hot-skilled rather than high-skilled because the demand for different types of skills depends on what major corporations and other economic players reward at any given moment. But the more important and interesting part of the answer is in its social dimension, which has many aspects to itself. I'd like to highlight three such dimensions. The first social dimension has to do with a technophilic culture that puts a higher premium on machines than on human beings. It is in this culture that companies and organizations almost always showcase their technologies as opposed to people as indicators of knowledge, power, and competence. The Enron debacle in 2001 was a prominent example, as some of us remember, but that culture has not disappeared, as we see in these images of Tesla. The second dimension is somewhat related to the first one and has to do with the division of labor between humans and machines. It used to be the case that machines served human beings doing things that human beings were either not willing or not capable of doing, as I have discussed in heteromation, but now the opposite is happening. We are doing things that machines are not capable of doing. Both of these, technophilia and heteromation, are relatively well understood, but there is a third social dimension that is more directly relevant to telework, and I'd like to highlight that today. This is much deeper and much more pernicious for that. Let's call it social differentiation or social variance or social difference. I believe that capitalism as a socioeconomic system thrives on difference, and it generates difference wherever possible. Notice that I say difference and not discrimination because I think that discrimination is just the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Difference can come in different forms: spatial, temporal, technological, and of course, social. In terms of spatio-temporal difference, Karl Marx showed 150 years ago that capitalism constantly reconfigures the relationship between space and time in the interest of profit. In terms of social difference, there is a long and well-documented history of how the capitalist society has constantly benefited from differences in class, gender, ethnicity, race, and even disability. I see the rise of telework as yet another example of difference that builds on and subsumes all the earlier kinds of difference: spatial, temporal, technological, and social, and adds new layers to them. I certainly understand the benefits of telework for certain jobs and certain groups of people. I myself have benefited from this during COVID as a professor. I don't want to minimize these benefits, but I'd like to connect these to deeper underlying issues in our socioeconomic system and warn against the possibility of telework largely working against workers and employees. For instance, the possibility of deterioration of wages and working conditions that Philippe Foncé raised in his recent article that was shared with us today. To go back to us, to the Amazon example, we might be working against ourselves in the words of Tim Wu, who said this: Amazon is a microeconomist's wet dream. If you are a consumer, it's perfect for maximizing the efficiency of finding what you want and getting it as cheap, as fast as possible. But the thing is, most of us aren't just consumers. We are also producers or manufacturers or employees, or we live in cities where the retailers have gone out of business because they can't compete with Amazon. And so Amazon kind of pits us against ourselves. So I'm just finishing, Aida. Sorry if I hope I'm not going over my time. Am I? I am. I'll finish. I'll wrap up in a second. So finally, I want to end on this note that all of this matters because, as the wobbly motto goes, an injury to one is injury to all. Let me just leave it at that. I had some other things to say, but let me just leave it and open up for questions. I apologize if I went over time.
Thank you very much, Hamid, for this fascinating and provoking presentation about counterfactual scenarios of wealth transfer and the three social issues: technophilic culture, the division of labor between human and machines, and of course, the different forms and layers of the social difference. And with that, I would like to open the floor to the audience. And here we have already some questions in the chat that I will like to put forward. The first one from Gérard Valenduc. How is it possible that remote work increases productivity when teleworkers report to work longer hours to produce the same output? In this case, productivity decreases. In this case, productivity decreases, isn't it? Who would like to respond to it? Just please open the microphone. Thank you.
I can take that since I think it was probably directed at me, because I said that there were some research indicating productivity. There's a well-known study by Bloom et al. That came out, I think it was in 2015, and it was a natural experiment, well, actually a designed experiment that was done with the Chinese call center, where the staff got to choose whether they wanted to work from home or not. These were call center workers. Half of them went home, half of them stayed in the office, and they were able to monitor and control and their output and so forth. And they found that the staff actually that worked from home were able to take more calls and were more productive. So there have been some studies that have been showing higher productivity. But Gerard is correct that a lot of the benefit has been really that just people are putting in more working hours. So of course their output is increasing at their own personal cost, but because they're not getting overtime for those hours, it's just a benefit for the firm. So in that respect, that is correct.
Thank you, Janine. And another question from the audience. I'll take the third one here. The person would like to hear your take on a framework in which remote workers, newcomers, will never meet, hardly forge relations of solidarity or social capital, probably are even in different countries. It is not one of the biggest threats of remote work, the sharp diminishment of workers' agency due to the automation? Well, that's the question. Sure. Trade unions, it says, will need to adapt. But won't this be a major challenge, even when there is no outsourcing? Maybe Valerio, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Of course, this is going to be a huge challenge, the way in which you can forge solidarity links between people that work only from remote. It's already something that we see. It's extremely difficult for crowd workers to organize themselves, even though some attempts are there. But definitely this is going to be a huge challenge for the unions. At the same time, I don't think it is going to be possible for the unions to oppose to remote work and to hybrid work. That I think it is clear that many people want that, and I'm not sure opposing to this would work for unions.
All right, thank you very much. And I would like to come back to the gender disparities. Maybe Hamid Ekpia, you would like to respond when the audience asks about this. When naming the age-related obstacles, only younger people career development is mentioned. What about older people, she asks?
well, the age and gender are different issues, but somewhat maybe related. I think the gender aspect is more clear in terms of how it has affected women largely. In the US, the statistics are astonishing in terms of the number of women who have had to leave their jobs because during COVID they didn't have child support and so on and so forth. That's, I think, maybe uniquely or largely American phenomena than European, but I think it is very much related to how still, in our current culture in the US, maybe elsewhere as well, mothers take most of the burden for childcare and housework and so on and so forth. With aging, I think I'm not sure if I have any useful insights to add, but maybe the issue of technological savviness is an obstacle because the older people are not as at ease as much as the younger people with technology. So that puts them at a disadvantage. I've heard, from just personal experience, of my children who work remotely about their colleagues, older colleagues, how much they are struggling with this. And I'm sure many of you also have heard similar stories. That's as much as I can say about age.
Thank you, Hamid. And maybe I don't see any other specific questions to the audience if you would like to. Oh, right. So there is a question to Mrs. Berg. And Tommaso says, could Mrs. Berg indicate where the data on the percentage of workers who switched to telework during the pandemic comes from? Thank you, Janine, for taking this.
Sure. So this is from an ILO policy brief that we published at the beginning of the pandemic. We did an analysis to see how many professions could be teleworkable across the world, and so we published a policy brief on that. But that was based on expert opinion of experts across the world. So then earlier this year, what we did is, this is along with mainly my colleague Sergey Suarez who did this. There was 33 labor force surveys that had data with a place of work question and pandemic data. And so he was able to see how many people were working from home during the pandemic, and then did an imputation depending on the levels of economic development. And so that's where we came up with the figures, the global figures. And this is available in an ILO policy brief. And we now have an info story that just came out last week. That's where that data is from. So if you go on the ILO website and you Google it, you can find it. Otherwise, write to me and I'll send it to you.
Thank you, Janine, for your availability. And just to close the panel, really, unless one of you would like to say something or to react to each other, probably. Not really, but all three of you spoke about the benefits and also the risks of hybrid work, telework. What is your opinion on how to better reconcile this?
I guess I could go. I don't know. I
would like to hear all of you.
Okay. So I'll go first. And I mean, I think if there is a regulatory framework and there's collective bargaining, either collective bargaining or statutory laws, and laws are complied with, then I think there isn't really a problem or too much of a problem. The risk is that because of the virtual space, it's much easier to evade the law in this virtual space. And so that's what I see is the real problem. But I think as long as the laws are being respected and there's worker voice and there's collective agency and all these things, then I think there can be very positive benefits to teleworking. And I think particularly also hybrid workspaces tend to work the best.
Professor Valerio Di Stefano.
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree with Janine. I think there are a lot of benefits to reap out of this, but we need regulation. We need to attune some of the existing regulation and also to employ the existing regulation to govern these phenomena. One of the things we haven't mentioned is how people that only work from remote or stick with hybrid work may be penalized in terms of career development and promotion, et cetera, et cetera. So we might even think of establishing some some principle of equal treatment with remote workers. There's a lot of things we have to think about. I think, again, this is here to stay. The only way to make it better is to regulate this wisely.
Thank you. And before we close, Professor Hamid Ekbia, just your final words on this.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with what Janine and Valerio said, but also, maybe in some other words, historically resistance, organizing. I think, we've seen examples of this by in Silicon Valley in the last few years, and more recently. I think that has to be encouraged and shared so that other people are aware, just resistance, to some of these trends.
Okay, Janine Berg, Valerio De Stefano, and Hamid Ekbias, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for answering the questions from our audience. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Nicola Contouris, the director of the research department, so that he can have a time to give the final remarks. Thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you very much, Aida. Nobody has called me Professor Contouris in 6 or 7 years, I think, but thank you. I think this was a spectacular session and a great conclusion to a wonderful workshop. And we have illustrated many of the perils and some of the benefits of telework. And I think the greatest benefit that has clearly emerged from today's experience, although I very much feel for Hamid's jet lag, is the opportunity for connectedness and collaboration, and ultimately work that telework, remote work offer. And it's one of the paradoxes of this pandemic that it has allowed us to celebrate and to recognize the value of a number of factors in societies, in our lives, that we were giving for granted. I mean, people have written profusely about the return of big state, how the state is important, how public support and macroeconomic intervention have been able to salvage millions and millions of jobs that were put on income support scheme and this and that. We have, I think, not celebrated enough labor. I think this is something I came across very vividly in this panel, thanks to your interventions, how much workers have really pulled up the socks in a period that I think is only comparable to much more dramatic periods of history in the 20th century. And it's certainly the case that 40 million European workers had their jobs and incomes propped up by job and income support scheme, short-term work, but 150 million more were there every day trying to put new arrangements in place in order to make sure that labor could continue to be at the center of our lives, the way it should be, but the way it isn't, because it isn't always recognized for the important factor of human existence, which is something which Hamid has written wonderfully well and amiably about in his many, many writings. I think this is partly of what we are trying to do here at the ETUI, celebrating the importance of labor, celebrating the importance of unions that have played a crucial role in this pandemic, and of course also opening our eyes to the many perils that emerge in this great transformation and this great period of change. And we will continue to do so. This is just the beginning. In fact, it's not even the beginning. We started a while ago a number of projects on this topic, and I very much hope that many of today's speakers and indeed chairs who are all experts in their own right and have all been working on this topic in recent months here at the ETUI. We want to be involved. So thank you very much to speakers. Thank you very much to our chairs, to our public, and a great thank to our organizers, Maria Nikolova, Sophie Cassius, who was involved early on, and to the working group on remote working here at the ETUI. Thank you all. Keep in touch. See you all soon. Bye.